Hey friends, tonight we step quietly into the bustling yet strangely overlooked world of ancient Rome, not through its generals or its emperors, but through the ink-stained hands of a man whose work shaped the lives of thousands without ever earning him fame. The Scribe, a figure so ordinary that history rarely pauses to name him, and yet so essential that Rome's empire could not have functioned without him. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and maybe what book or drink you have by your side tonight. It's always calming to see this little community gathering together across time zones, each of us ready to drift into a slower, quieter corner of the past. Now, dim the lights, let the outside world slip away, and if you can, imagine the faint scratching of a stylus on wax, or the soft rasp of a reed pen against papyrus. Tonight we will walk, unhurried, through a single day in the life of a Roman scribe. The first light of day in Rome rarely entered suddenly. Instead, it crept, filtering faintly over the 7 hills, catching first on the highest rooftops, then spilling slowly down into the narrow valleys where the city's streets lay crowded and restless. It was an awakening that had repeated for centuries, indifferent to emperors, indifferent to triumphs or defeats, indifferent even to the lives of the men and women who shuffled through its endless cycles of noise and silence. The year itself, whichever it may have been, mattered little to the stones, yet the people who lived among them carried forward their tasks as though nothing in the world existed beyond their obligations. The Roman dawn was not peaceful, it was not soft. The cobblestones echoed early with the rattle of carts, pulled by donkeys whose hooves rang against the worn paving stones of the via. Vendors stirred before the sun's edge appeared, their voices low at first, then rising in insistent calls as they arranged baskets of olives, loaves of coarse bread, or amphorae of sour wine to be sold to passers-by. Fires, lit hastily in cramped hearths, released faint coils of smoke into the still air, mingling with the heavier smells of damp straw, manure, and cooking oil. For a scribe, whose day would be spent with stylus and wax, or pen and ink, the sounds and smells of the city formed the backdrop of his existence. His role, quiet and necessary, was never free of the city's noise. Every contract he would inscribe, every petition he would record, was accompanied by the dull roar of Rome itself, a reminder that words on papyrus could outlast the fleeting commotion of the street. Yet here, at dawn, the tension between silence and clamor was most stark. The city was alive, but its fullness had not yet reached its peak. The insula, the tall apartment blocks in which most of the city's working population lived, stirred unevenly. Some households woke early, preparing for labor or for trade. Others lingered in slumber, unwilling to rise until the heat forced them from restless sleep. Windows opened with a creak, shutters pushed aside to allow in air that was already tinged with dust. The scribe's dwelling, modest and unremarkable, belonged to this same rhythm. His neighbors, craftsmen, sellers, laborers and families, contributed their voices to the chorus of the morning without thought of whether anyone listened. The geography of Rome framed the scene in a way that could never be separated from its people. To the east, the Palatine Hill caught the sun before any other, its villas and imperial palaces casting long shadows downward. To the north, the Capitoline stood, where temples and official buildings dominated the skyline. Between them, the low-lying forum began to stir, where officials, magistrates and scribes alike would soon take their places among the colonnades and basilicas. At this early hour, it was still quiet there, but quiet in Rome was always temporary. What struck the visitor, and what the native no longer noticed, was the constant layering of time upon place. Dawn revealed it in pieces, ancient temples rebuilt and rebuilt again, their stones blackened by centuries of offerings, streets whose paving was cut and patched with repairs from dozens of generations, monuments already weathered, though they stood in the memory of living men as newly raised. The scribe who walked these streets each day absorbed this continuity unconsciously. To him, it was simply Rome. To us, it is the backdrop of history itself. The animals of the city stirred as well. Dogs scavenged among refuse piles, their ribs visible against their coats. Birds swooped down to pick at scraps, their cries rising above the human sounds. Chickens clucked in courtyards, and caged songbirds sang as though to compete with the carts. The Tiber River, flowing sluggishly through the heart of the city, reflected the first colors of dawn, its surface broken occasionally by ferrymen guiding their loads across. The smell of the river drifted outward, heavy, organic, not entirely pleasant, but to the Roman nose it was ordinary, expected. For those who worked with words, dawn was not yet the time for writing. It was a time for observing, for acknowledging the order of the world before retreating into the order of documents. The scribe's wax tablets rested in his dwelling, awaiting the scratch of his stylus. His reed pens lay cut, the nibs prepared, and the small pots of ink were sealed to keep them from drying. Papyrus sheets, imported from Egypt, carefully rolled, waited to be filled. But in this moment, with dawn still unfolding, the tools were silent, and the scribe himself was a witness rather than an actor. The sounds swelled as the sun rose further, metal rang as shopkeepers lifted shutters. Public fountains gushed, their water drawn by women carrying amphorae on their shoulders. Soldiers on early patrol stamped their feet, their armor clinking as they passed through the streets. Priests, moving toward temples, muttered low prayers, and the first wisps of incense began to rise from altars. Rome was never still for long, yet for all its noise, the city carried within it a stillness of a different kind, the stillness of routine. Every sound had its place, every action repeated itself day after day, so that the chaos became predictable. The carts would always rattle, the dogs would always bark, the priests would always light their incense. The scribes too would always sit and write. The dawn was not new, it was merely another link in an endless chain, binding one day to the next indistinguishable, unless one chose to remember. And so the scribe, rising from his bed, looked out at the waking city with no particular astonishment. Rome awoke as it always did, and he would follow the path laid out for him, a path that belonged less to choice than to necessity. For the city was vast, and its machinery demanded words, records, numbers and signatures. His life was but one fragment of its pulse, quiet and replaceable, but necessary all the same. The dawn had fully broken, the roofs glowed, the streets were busy, and the day's labor was waiting. The scribe's quiet roll was set against a city that never ceased its motion, and yet it was within this noise that his silent work mattered most. The sun had risen over Rome, and the scribe's day was about to begin. The insula was never designed for comfort. It was designed for efficiency, for density, for the needs of a city that held hundreds of thousands of people within walls that strained to contain them. Rome was a metropolis of ambition and spectacle, but its grandeur was reserved for the palaces on the Palatine, the temples on the Capitoline, and the long colonnades that lined the Forum. For the ordinary citizen, the scribe among them, daily life began not in marble halls but in the stacked brick and timber frames of the insulae. These apartment blocks rose several stories high, their walls close enough to press shadows against one another, their staircases narrow, their wooden beams creaking under the weight of too many tenants. The scribe's dwelling was situated not on the ground floor, where shopkeepers claimed the prime space to sell their goods, but higher up, where the air was thinner and the climb more tiring. The lower levels of insulae were coveted, for they allowed easier access, more stable floors, and sometimes even running water from pipes that connected to Rome's vast aqueduct system. Those who could not afford such small luxuries lived further above, where water had to be carried up by hand, and where fire hazards were more frequent. The scribe's apartment belonged to this middle realm, not the worst but far from the best. The structure itself was plain, brick walls plastered over in faded white, with cracks running like faint veins where time and weather had worn at them. Small windows admitted narrow beams of light, but their purpose was ventilation as much as illumination. Shutters could be drawn across them, though most of the time they remained open, for the air inside grew heavy when confined. The door was simple wood, marked by years of use, its hinges groaning whenever it was pushed. Inside, the space was modest, consisting of only a few rooms at most. A main area where the scribe ate and worked when at home, a small alcove where he slept, and perhaps a corner that served as a kitchen. The kitchen, if it could be called that, contained no large oven, for such luxuries were rare in insulae. Instead, there was a portable brazier, a small clay or metal vessel in which coals could be placed to heat food or boil water. Most cooking in Rome was done in public bakeries or food stalls, which served the needs of tenants who had neither the means nor the space to cook elaborate meals at home. Thus the dwelling bore the faint scent of charcoal and oil, but rarely of fresh bread, which was purchased elsewhere and carried in wrapped loaves. The furniture was sparse, a low wooden table, uneven at one leg, its surface worn smooth by years of use, a few stools, their woven seats fraying, a bed, little more than a wooden frame with a mattress stuffed from straw or wool, covered with a blanket coarse to the touch. Storage was limited to small chests, into which were placed clothing, writing materials, and perhaps a few keepsakes of personal value. To step into such a space was to step into a world defined not by abundance but by restraint, where each item had its place, and where the absence of luxury was not unusual but expected. The sensory world within was distinct. The plaster walls gave off a faint earthy smell, especially in damp weather. Dust collected in the corners, stirred whenever the shutters opened to admit a breeze. The brazier, when lit, filled the space with a smoky tang that clung to fabric and skin. Sounds from outside never stayed outside. The voices of neighbors, the creaking of upper floors, the footsteps on staircases, the bark of dogs in courtyards, the shouting of vendors below, all these were part of the interior, inseparable from the dwelling itself. Silence was a rarity, and solitude was never complete. And yet, within this modest space, the scribe maintained a small corner of order. His writing implements were stored carefully, wax tablets, bound together in diptychs and triptychs, stacked neatly within a chest. Styluses of bronze and iron, their points sharpened for use, rested beside them. Rolls of papyrus, costly and therefore precious, were stored away from moisture and light. A small bottle of ink, made from soot, mixed with water and gum, was sealed tightly with wax. These objects gave the apartment its character more than any decoration, for they reflected the scribe's profession, and they were treated with more care than the furnishings themselves. The walls bore little ornament. Perhaps a simple oil lamp hung from a hook, its flame filling the room with shadows at night. Perhaps a small painting or mosaic fragment, worn and faded, clung to the plaster as a remnant of an earlier tenant. More enduring were the household gods. In the corner, a small shrine, a lararium, held tiny figures of the lares and penates, protectors of the home and hearth. Offerings of grain or wine were placed there, not lavish but sincere, a daily act of reverence that tied the scribe to the traditions of Rome. Even in modest homes, these shrines carried meaning, for they bound the living to their ancestors, and reminded them that the divine inhabited even the smallest of dwellings. From the window, the view was limited. Across a narrow street stood another insula, its facade close enough that the tenants could have spoken to one another across the gap. Laundry hung from ropes, drying in the morning air. Children leaned out of windows, their voices carrying upward. On the street below, shopkeepers set out their wares, and the smell of baking bread or frying fish drifted upward to mingle with the odors of refuse. It was a city compressed into every sense, pressing itself upon the residents without pause. Fire was the ever-present danger in such a place. The insula, built with wood and plaster as well as brick, were vulnerable. A single overturned lamp could set a blaze that climbed upward with terrifying speed, consuming floor after floor. Collapses, too, were not rare, as foundations strained under the weight of multiple stories. For the scribe as for all tenants, these dangers were simply part of life, risks accepted because the city offered no alternatives for those without wealth. His home was fragile, but it was his. What gave the dwelling its meaning was not grandeur but familiarity. The scribe returned here each evening, to the same bed, the same stool, the same chest of tools. Here he performed the small rituals of daily life, the washing of hands and face, the donning of simple tunics, the eating of bread dipped in oil, the muttered prayers before the household gods. The dwelling's modesty concealed its role as the anchor of his existence. It was the space that divided labor from rest, public from private, duty from reflection. Thus, the humble insular apartment, overlooked by the marble monuments of the city, carried within it the quiet persistence of ordinary lives. To the passerby, it was one among hundreds, unremarkable, indistinguishable. To the scribe, it was the world he inhabited most closely, a world of sound and smell, of wood and plaster, of ink and wax, of gods and neighbors. It was a dwelling shaped not for display but for endurance, fragile yet enduring all the same. Mourning for the Roman scribe was never hurried, yet it was never idle. It followed a pattern, repeated day after day, shaped as much by necessity as by tradition. The dwelling, modest and enclosed, contained the means for preparing the body, and the spirit for labor, though small in scale. Each act was part of a larger rhythm that bound the individual to Rome's daily life, and to the gods who were thought to govern even the smallest details of existence. The first attention was given to hygiene, as far as it was understood in Roman practice. The insula had no private water supply. Only the wealthiest of houses were graced with their own pipes and cisterns. Instead, the scribe fetched water from a nearby public fountain, or had kept a clay amphora filled from the day before. The water was not clear by modern standards, carrying with it the faint taste of stone and sediment, but it was life's necessity, drawn from the aqueducts that spanned the countryside. From this amphora, he poured water into a shallow basin. Washing was simple. A cloth, dipped and wrung, wiped across the face, the arms, the neck. The hands were scrubbed carefully, for they would later hold stylus and pen, and cleanliness was as much a practical concern as a ritual one. Soap in the modern sense was not common. Instead, the Romans used powders of pumice, ash, or even oil rubbed onto the skin and scraped away. For the scribe, whose means were modest, a rough cloth and water sufficed. When the face was dried with a fragment of linen, the air, though heavy with the odors of the city, felt sharper, cooler, more fit for beginning the day. Clothing was next, chosen not with vanity but with function. The tunic was the most basic garment, a simple piece of wool or linen, belted at the waist. Its fibers were rough against the skin, but the body was accustomed to it. Over this, in colder months, might be worn a cloak, the paninula, draped and fastened with a simple brooch. The toga, the garment of ceremony and status, was not for him. It belonged to magistrates and citizens of higher station, and even then it was cumbersome, reserved for public events. The scribe's attire was unadorned, but it marked him as a man of letters, distinct from laborers in tunics stained with soil or craftsmen in aprons worn thin by work. Sandals of leather, strapped about the feet, completed the attire, their soles tough enough to endure the stones of the street, yet thin enough that each step carried the echo of the city beneath. After dressing came the meal, modest and quick. The Roman morning meal, the intaculum, was never elaborate. Bread, coarse and dark, made from wheat or barley, was the staple. A small piece was broken, dipped into olive oil, or sprinkled with a few herbs or salt. On fortunate days, there might be a portion of cheese, sharp and pungent, or dried fruit such as figs or dates, remnants of trade from distant provinces. The scribe ate sparingly, not from austerity alone, but because the larger meal, the cena, came in the evening. Morning food was meant only to steady the stomach until midday, when work demanded pause. The sounds of the city outside continued, now louder, as neighbors descended the staircases. Vendors shouted below, and the carts began to clog the narrow streets. But within the apartment, another obligation remained before the scribe could leave. The household gods, silent figures stationed in their lararium, required attention. The shrine was small, set in a corner of the main room, its plaster niche, decorated perhaps with faded paint or a simple design. Within stood the lories, protectors of the household, and the penates, guardians of the pantry and provisions. To them, each day, the scribe gave a token offering, a pinch of grain, a drop of wine, a morsel of bread. The act was not grand, not like the sacrifices at great temples, but it was steady, and it bound him to the traditions of his ancestors. He lit a small lamp before the figures, murmured a prayer, and bowed his head. For a moment, the noise of the insula seemed distant. The flame flickered, shadows bent across the walls, and the scribe felt himself part of something continuous, a chain of rituals stretching back generations. It was not faith in the sense of certainty, it was habit, woven into the fabric of life, inseparable from the act of rising, dressing, or eating. Without it, the day felt incomplete, unmoored. With it, the day gained shape, not because the gods demanded it, but because life demanded order. And so the small shrine, with its figures blackened by lamp smoke, was as essential to the scribe as his tools of writing. After these preparations, he gathered what was necessary for the day. The wax tablets, bound together with leather straps, were tucked into a bag or carried under the arm. A stylus, its point sharp for inscribing, and its flat end for erasing, was slipped into a case. On days when papyrus was needed, a roll might be carried carefully, though often such materials awaited him at his place of work. Ink and reed pens were less commonly carried, for the fragility of the pen and the risk of spilling ink made it preferable to keep them stored where he would sit. But still, the tools of his trade were never far from reach, for they defined his identity as much as his tunic or sandals. Before leaving, he looked once more around the small dwelling. The bed, rumpled but serviceable, would be waiting at night. The brazier, now cool, stood against the wall. The chest, closed, held what little wealth he possessed, and in the corner, the lararium still glowed faintly, its lamp burning down to ash. This was his private world, enclosed and narrow, yet it was the foundation upon which the public day would rise. Stepping out onto the staircase of the insula, he joined the current of neighbors descending toward the street. The stairwell was dark, lit only by the beams of sunlight that filtered from upper windows. The walls were scuffed by countless hands. The smell of smoke and cooking drifted upward. Each step creaked, carrying with it the weight of generations of tenants, and as he moved downward, he left behind the quiet rituals of the home and entered into the unrelenting current of Rome itself. The morning ritual was complete. The body was washed, the tunic tied, the bread eaten, the gods appeased, the tools gathered. The scribe was ready, not in the sense of eagerness, but in the sense of preparedness. Rome awaited, with its chaos, its demands, its endless need for words. The scribe's life was bound not merely to places or people, but to objects. Small objects, often fragile, sometimes costly, yet essential in ways that transcended their material form. Tools of writing gave shape to his days, defined his purpose, and tethered him to Rome's vast machinery of record and administration. Without them, his labor would be impossible. With them, words took form, and thoughts became permanent. The world of writing was a quiet craft, yet within it lay the power to preserve laws, secure contracts, and transmit knowledge. The most common and practical tool was the wax tablet. To the eye, it resembled a small wooden board, rectangular and shallow, its surface recessed slightly, so that melted wax could be poured within. Once cooled, the wax formed a smooth plane, darkened with soot to provide contrast for the letters inscribed upon it. Tablets were rarely solitary. They were bound in pairs or trios with leather thongs or cords, forming diptychs or triptychs. Their portability made them indispensable for notes, drafts, and everyday transactions. To write upon the wax, the scribe carried a stylus. The stylus was a simple instrument, most often made of bronze, iron, or bone, sometimes of ivory for wealthier owners. It had two ends, one sharpened to a point, the other flattened into a spatula-like shape. With the point, letters were cut into the wax in thin grooves. With the flat end, mistakes could be smoothed over, the wax pressed flat again, leaving a surface ready to be written upon anew. In this way, the tablet was endlessly reusable, and its impermanence was its strength. Contracts could be drafted, calculations made, messages written quickly, then erased when no longer needed. The sound of the stylus scratching into wax was familiar to all scribes, a muted rasp that accompanied their thoughts like the rhythm of breath. Yet wax tablets, for all their utility, were not suited for permanence. For that, papyrus was required, imported from Egypt. Papyrus was Rome's gateway to durability. Made from the pith of the papyrus plant, cut into strips, pressed and dried, the sheets were joined into long rolls, sometimes several meters in length. To unroll such a document was to reveal words in sequence, like the unfolding of time itself. A scribe working with papyrus handled it with care, for it was costly, its supply dependent upon trade, and its surface unforgiving of errors. Unlike wax, ink could not be smoothed away with the flat end of a stylus. Each mark was permanent, and therefore demanded precision. For papyrus, the scribe required different instruments. Chief among them was the reed pen, the calamus. Cut from reeds grown along the Nile, or in marshes closer to Rome, the pen was trimmed to a point, its tip split with a careful cut to allow ink to flow. A sharp knife, kept always at hand, served to recut and reshape the nib when it wore down. The reed pen was delicate, easily frayed, and yet in skilled hands it produced a flow of letters that could range from fine and precise to broad and expressive. Its fragility demanded patience, for haste could snap the nib, spill the ink, or ruin the sheet. Ink itself was another world of craft. Most Roman ink was made from soot, mixed with water, and bound with gum arabic to give it adhesion. Stored in small clay or glass pots, it dried quickly when exposed to air, and therefore had to be sealed when not in use. Some inks were tinted with other substances, yielding shades beyond black, but for scribes in official work, clarity and contrast were valued over ornament. The smell of ink, faintly acrid, earthy, was as familiar as the smell of wax. Once it stained a finger or sleeve, it lingered, a quiet badge of the profession. The act of writing was not merely the movement of hand upon surface, it was the management of tools, each with its own temperament. The stylus required pressure, but not too much, lest the wax break. The reed pen required balance, ink feeding steadily without blotting. The papyrus required steadiness, its fibers guiding the stroke of the pen, its surface resisting correction. To the untrained eye these objects seemed simple, to the scribe, they were instruments of discipline. Storage of these tools was careful, for loss or damage meant disruption. The tablets could be stacked in chests, their cords tied tightly. The styluses were wrapped in cloth, or kept in small cases, their points protected from bending. Papyrus rolls were stored upright, bound and labeled, placed where moisture would not reach them. Ink pots were sealed with wax stoppers. The reed pens, cut and fragile, were bundled together, ready for sharpening as needed. These collections gave the scribe's modest dwelling its character. Where another man's apartment might show tools of trade, a hammer, a loom, a potter's wheel, the scribe showed only boards, pens and scrolls, yet these were his livelihood, as tangible as any craft. Each tool carried with it a lineage of invention. The wax tablet and stylus had roots in Greek practice, adopted and refined by Rome. The papyrus came from Egypt, whose craftsmen had produced it for millennia. The reed pen, too, owed its design to Egyptian scribes, though Rome made it its own. Ink, though simple in composition, was a legacy of countless experiments, its recipe passed down in workshops and recorded in manuals. The scribe, though a small man in Rome's hierarchy, stood at the intersection of these traditions, inheriting a craft that was as old as civilization itself. To work with these tools was to engage with time. Words written on wax might vanish within hours, erased and forgotten, but words on papyrus could endure for centuries, carried in archives, stored in temples, or read aloud in courts. The permanence of ink gave weight to decisions, bound men to their contracts, recorded the edicts of emperors, and preserved the laws that governed daily life. The scribe, though silent in his task, participated in this continuity. His hand was the channel through which fleeting speech became lasting record, and yet the tools themselves bore no grandeur. They were humble, often plain, their worth lying not in beauty, but in utility. A stylus might be little more than a sharpened stick of metal. A reed pen was scarcely different from the reeds that grew by the river banks. A pot of ink looked no more significant than any other vessel. Only in the act of use did they acquire meaning, and only in the scribe's hand did they reveal their purpose. Thus, the tools of writing were not mere accessories to his profession, they were extensions of his being. They shaped his day as surely as his dwelling, or his rituals. They reminded him that while Rome thundered with noise outside, within his grasp lay the quiet labor of inscription, the steady marks that built contracts, preserved accounts, and gave the empire its written memory. When he gathered these tools, checked their readiness, and placed them into his satchel, he was not only preparing for work, he was preparing to enter into Rome's machinery, to contribute silently to its order. The wax, the stylus, the ink, the papyrus, the reed pen. Together they formed his craft, and through them, the voice of the empire itself would be recorded. The scribe's day extended outward from the threshold of his modest insula, beginning with the simple act of walking. What might appear as a routine commute carried with it the daily immersion into the life of the Roman city, where every street was a stage for society, commerce, and ritual. In the still cool air of the morning, before the sun reached its noon brilliance, Rome stirred with a rising hum. The streets, narrow in many places, broadened into avenues, leading from clusters of homes toward markets, temples, and administrative quarters. The cobbled stones beneath his sandals had been worn by countless feet, hooves, and wheels. They bore the marks of grooved cart tracks, the faint sheen of centuries of passage, and the dust of the Tiber carried on the morning breeze. Along these stones the scribe walked, satchel slung over his shoulder, his step steady, his eyes both attentive and reserved. For while he was one among thousands, his occupation lent him a strange duality, an invisibility to those of higher rank, and yet an indispensability within the structures that govern them all. As he turned into the main street, he passed the vendors already beginning their trade. Bakers brought out baskets of bread, their surfaces browned and split with the heat of the communal ovens. The smell of fresh loaves drifted on the air, mingled with the acrid scent of charcoal fires from cooks preparing gruels and stews. Or wine sellers unsealed their jars, allowing the pungent aroma of sour and sweet vintages to fill their stalls. The cries of hawkers blended into a tapestry of sound, invitations, bargains, and boasts, shouted in rhythm, filling the narrow spaces between stone facades. Among them moved people of every station. Freedmen, carrying trays or bundles, hurried to deliver goods to their patrons. Matrons, veiled and accompanied by attendants, walked carefully to temples or markets. Slaves, marked by their collars, carried amphorae or swept doorways. Soldiers, their armor glinting faintly, strode with purposeful pace, their presence both reassuring and foreboding. Senators, borne in litters or accompanied by clients, passed with an air of distance, scarcely noticing those around them. Children darted between feet, their games momentarily filling the spaces before being scattered by carts or reprimands. Temples rose above the streets at intervals, their columns catching the light of the rising sun. Each bore the scent of incense, faint but persistent, carried out through their open doors. Worshippers entered quietly, offering prayers or tokens, their murmurs joining the drone of the city's morning. The scribe, though not wealthy enough to patronize the grander temples often, paused inwardly as he passed them. The presence of the gods was never absent, for their statues looked out over the city, and their rites accompanied its every function. To walk to work was to pass under their silent gaze, a reminder that all labors, however humble, existed within the order they were believed to maintain. Occasionally, a procession would intrude upon the routine of the morning. A priest might be seen leading a small group, carrying offerings toward an altar. Musicians played pipes or beat on drums, their tones dissonant yet steady, the sound cutting through the shouts of vendors. Sometimes officials passed in greater number, their escorts clearing the street ahead, their garments marking their authority. The people moved aside, some with indifference, others with a show of respect, depending on who the figure was and what reputation he carried. The scribe watched such processions from the margins, careful to step aside, neither eager to show reverence nor bold enough to appear careless. The architecture itself framed the walk. Multi-storied insulae loomed overhead, their balconies strung with drying clothes, their windows alive with glimpses of domestic activity. Below, shops opened directly onto the street, their counters projecting outward, their interiors dim, stocked with goods ranging from olives to shoes, pottery to lamps. Larger structures announced themselves with greater permanence. Bathhouses, their entrances marked with carved stone and tiled mosaics. Granaries with their doors wide enough for carts. Storehouses, heavy with the smell of grain, oil or fish sauce. Each contributed its texture to the street, reminding the walker that Rome's life was not only political and ceremonial but profoundly economic. Crossing from one street to another required stepping stones raised slightly above the road. Between these stones, carts passed, while pedestrians moved from one side to the other without soiling their sandals in the runoff and refuse that often collected in the gutters. The stones bore the polish of years of wear, and the careful step required to cross them became part of the rhythm of the walk. Beneath this movement, one could hear the trickle of water from aqueduct-fed pipes or cisterns, Rome's hidden veins that supplied its fountains and baths. The scribe's attention, though outwardly modest, absorbed these details. The city, though immense, revealed itself in such moments: the clamor of trade, the hierarchies of movement, the sense of food and smoke, the silent weight of temples, the interruptions of ritual, the backdrop of architecture. Walking through Rome was less a journey from one place to another than a gradual immersion into layers of existence, each overlapping, each contributing to the fabric of daily life. As he neared the Forum, the density of people increased. This was the heart of Rome, where commerce, politics, and law converged. Merchants displayed their goods more elaborately here. Statues of magistrates and emperors loomed larger. The cries of sellers mingled with the more serious tones of legal disputes, speeches, and proclamations. To cross this space was to glimpse the fullness of Roman society, from its poorest beggars to its most influential leaders. Yet even here, the scribe remained what he always was, a quiet figure with a satchel of tools, moving purposefully but without spectacle, ready to serve his role within this vast organism. The walk to work ended not with a dramatic arrival but with a quiet turning inward. The scribe approached the building where he would labor, an office perhaps attached to a magistrate, a temple, or a private patron. From the noise of the streets he stepped into the comparative hush of the workplace, where the scratch of stylus or reed pen would replace the clamor of vendors and processions. The city remained alive outside, but within another rhythm would govern, the rhythm of words inscribed, documents copied, contracts recorded. Thus, each morning's walk was both ordinary and essential. It connected the private world of his insula with the public world of Rome, the domestic with the civic, the mundane with the monumental. It reminded him daily of the variety of lives around him, of the constant presence of gods and magistrates, of the ceaseless flow of commerce and ritual. And it prepared him, in its quiet way, to sit at his table, take up his tools, and add his marks to the empire's memory. The walk through the streets brought the scribe from the clamor of Rome's public spaces into the quieter, but no less significant world of his workplace. Depending upon his patronage and the demands of his station, this might be the tabularium, the great archive of the Roman state, the offices of magistrates, or the more modest confines of a private scribal shop. Each space carried its own atmosphere, shaped by architecture, by purpose, and by the expectations of those who worked within. To step across the threshold was to enter a domain where silence, precision, and discipline mattered more than the noise and chaos of the city outside. The tabularium, perched along the Capitoline Hill, represented the most formal environment in which a scribe might labor. Completed in 78 BCE, its massive stone structure loomed above the Forum, commanding attention with its monumental arches and tiered galleries. From its windows one could look down upon the civic heart of Rome, yet within its walls, the mood was inward, contemplative, and administrative. The archive housed laws, decrees, treaties, and financial records, the very backbone of Rome's legal and bureaucratic existence. To work here was to handle the written memory of the state, to copy and maintain documents that bound the Senate, magistrates, and citizens together. Inside, the rooms were cool and dim, lit by narrow slits or oil lamps that flickered faintly against stone walls. Shelves and niches lined the chambers, each holding scrolls bound with cords, their ends painted or inscribed with titles. Wooden chests protected older records, while clerks moved deliberately between them, retrieving or returning materials under the watch of overseers. The sound was subdued, the shuffle of sandals on stone, the faint scratch of stylus on wax, the whisper of reed pens across papyrus. It was not silence, but the quiet rhythm of administrative labor. The scribe assigned here would sit at a desk, often little more than a simple wooden table with a sloping surface. His tools, wax tablets for notes, papyrus for final copies, stylus, reed pens and ink, were arranged in careful order. His day consisted of copying decrees issued by magistrates, recording Senate decisions, or preparing duplicates of contracts for storage. Each task required patience, for the accuracy of the written word determined the validity of law. An error might alter a phrase, shift a meaning, or compromise an oath, and for this reason supervisors kept a strict eye on the work. In contrast, the offices of magistrates carried a different atmosphere. These spaces, attached to basilicas or administrative buildings near the forum, bustled with a mixture of legal proceedings, official meetings, and clerical labor. Here the scribe's work was more immediate, responding to the needs of praetors, quaestors, or aediles. One moment he might be drafting a legal summons, the next recording testimony, the next preparing accounts of expenditures. The environment was louder, with litigants and clients pressing into the chambers, advocates speaking at length, and messengers arriving with fresh instructions. The architecture reflected this mixture of grandeur and utility, columns and marble floors for authority, benches and desks for function. To serve in such a place demanded flexibility. The scribe sat slightly apart from the fray, recording the proceedings with speed but also discretion. His wax tablet was his companion, catching the rapid flow of words before they could be formalized into papyrus scrolls. Amid the clamor, he maintained composure, his role defined not by visibility but by reliability. Though he was rarely addressed directly, the record he produced gave permanence to what might otherwise dissolve into fleeting speech. Elsewhere, the scribe might labor in private shops, less formal but equally significant. Along certain streets, particularly near the forum or markets, scribal services were offered for hire. These shops were smaller, their architecture less imposing, but their atmosphere more varied. A merchant might come seeking a contract of sale. A citizen might require a letter composed in proper form. A freedman might wish to petition a magistrate and need assistance shaping his words. Here the scribe was not only a recorder but a mediator between literacy and illiteracy, between spoken intent and written form. The shop itself often opened onto the street, its front shaded by an awning. Within, shelves held supplies of papyrus, stacks of wax tablets and ink pots, while a simple bench or desk served as the workspace. Customers stood or sat while dictating, their voices filling the small room. The scribe listened attentively, stylus poised, then transformed their words into lines of writing, adjusting their phrasing into legal or formal idiom where necessary. The smell of ink mingled with the dust of the street, the murmur of conversation with the cries of vendors outside. It was a liminal space, neither entirely private nor fully public, where transactions of trust and knowledge unfolded. Despite their differences, all these workplaces shared certain qualities. They demanded order, accuracy, and patience. They organized space in ways that reflected hierarchy, supervisors above clerks, magistrates above scribes, clients above shopkeepers. They existed as nodes within the larger body of Rome, connecting the noise of the streets with the permanence of record. For the scribe, they represented both opportunity and constraint, places where his skill sustained him, but where his individuality was subsumed into the larger machinery of administration and commerce. The architecture itself reinforced this sense of duty. Stone walls, heavy wooden doors, marble floors, columns, shelves and desks created environments that were solid, weighty, and enduring. They were not spaces for comfort or ornament, but for labor and permanence. The air inside was cooler, the light dimmer, the noise subdued. Each day to cross the threshold from the brightness of the streets into these interiors was to step into another rhythm, one less spontaneous, more regulated. For the scribe, the workplace was not merely a location of employment, it was a world of objects, routines and expectations that defined his identity. Outside, he was another man among the masses. Inside, he was a custodian of words, a mediator of legality, a servant of permanence. His tools, which in his insula seemed fragile and modest, here gained weight, for they shaped the documents that governed lives, property, and memory. Thus, whether within the monumental halls of the tabularium, the crowded chambers of magistrates, or the modest shops that lined the streets, the scribe's workplace was the silent center of his world. The city outside might resound with clamor, ritual, and spectacle, but here, in the steady labor of writing, Rome's continuity was secured, one mark of stylus and stroke of pen at a time. The morning in the scribe's workplace did not remain empty for long. Once his desk was arranged, his wax tablets smoothed, his reed pens sharpened, and his ink pots opened, the flow of people began. Rome was a city not only of grandeur and spectacle, but of constant transaction, and every transaction, in one form or another, required words set into permanence. Speech was fleeting, memory was unreliable, but written text gave shape and weight to agreements, promises, and obligations. The scribe, humble in his social standing, stood at the point where private need met public formality. The first to arrive were often petitioners, men or women from the lower orders, who required assistance in presenting their cases to magistrates. They carried no scrolls of their own, for many were illiterate or lacked the confidence to compose in the rigid language of law. Instead, they brought stories of debts unpaid, of property disputed, of wrongs endured. Standing hesitantly before the desk, they spoke in plain words, their accents betraying origin, status, or occupation. The scribe listened carefully, his stylus poised over the wax. He transformed their rough speech into structured form, stripping it of redundancies, clothing it in the vocabulary expected by officials. What emerged on the tablet was not their voices spoken, but their voice reshaped, refined, and rendered legitimate. The petitioner, often unable to judge the transformation, placed trust in the scribe's skill. In this way, the scribe became not only a recorder, but a translator between social worlds. Next came traders, brisk and practical, their concerns less about eloquence and more about clarity. They required contracts of sale, records of delivery, and acknowledgements of debt. A trader selling grain might need an agreement specifying the amount, the weight, and the delivery date. A seller of amphorae might require a guarantee of payment in coin, rather than credit. These men, accustomed to bargaining in the marketplace, spoke quickly and expected efficiency. The scribe, in turn, reached for papyrus rather than wax, for these documents were to endure beyond the day. With reed pen dipped into ink, he recorded amounts, names, and conditions with precision, knowing that an error in a number or a clause could mean conflict later. The atmosphere was brisk, punctuated by the occasional counting of coins or the rustle of parchment. Lawyers or advocates also frequented the workplace. Unlike petitioners, they were literate and often skilled in rhetoric, yet they relied on scribes for the labor of transcription. They dictated speeches, legal arguments, or procedural motions, their voices deliberate and trained. The scribe wrote quickly, his stylus moving across wax in shorthand, his mind balancing the speed of dictation with the need for accuracy. These clients treated scribes as tools of efficiency, expecting drafts to be prepared swiftly, so they might review and deliver them before magistrates. In their presence, the workplace filled with a different kind of energy, not hurried commerce, but the calculated rhythm of oratory, reduced to silent marks. The scribe, though invisible in the courtroom, knew that his hand had shaped the words that would resound there. Alongside these more formal clients came the ordinary Romans, who sought assistance in smaller but no less important matters. A freedman, wishing to send a letter to a distant patron, a woman seeking to record her dowry arrangements, a family requesting a written will to secure inheritance, even slaves, entrusted with errands, delivering instructions from their masters to be transcribed. Each came with needs that were personal, often intimate, yet they unfolded across the scribe's desk with the same discipline of form. Letters required not only transcription, but proper salutation, and closing wills demanded exact phrasing to carry legal force. Dowry contracts required acknowledgement of witnesses and amounts. In these moments, the scribe was not merely a writer, but a custodian of trust, shaping documents that would govern lives, property, and memory within families. The workplace itself mirrored this diversity. Petitioners brought earnest voices, filling the air with their anxieties and hopes. Traders carried the scent of grain, oil, or spices on their garments, the smell of commerce mingling with the ink. Lawyers introduced a sharper tone, their rhetoric turning the quiet room into a rehearsal hall. Ordinary citizens introduced warmth, hesitation, or urgency. Each client left behind not only a document, but a trace of presence, a coin placed upon the desk as payment, a name inscribed upon papyrus, a sigh of relief as they departed. Hierarchy was always present, subtle but unyielding. A magistrate's messenger arriving with instructions was served first, regardless of who waited. A lawyer might command the space with his voice, while a petitioner shrank into silence. The scribe himself navigated these hierarchies carefully, never asserting authority, but always aware of it. His neutrality was part of his role. He was not to take sides, only to record faithfully. Yet in the quiet recesses of his mind, he carried impressions of desperation, of ambition, of arrogance, of need. He knew the city through its words, and its words passed through his hands each day. The flow of clients was not chaotic but steady, like a stream of lives intersecting with the discipline of writing. Each arrival brought new material to shape, new ink to spill, new tablets to fill. The rhythm of the day was marked not by the hours of the sun, but by the succession of voices transformed into text. Morning bled into noon, and noon into afternoon, as the scribe's desk became a point of intersection between the living pulse of Rome and the permanence of record. In this way, the arrival of clients defined the scribe's purpose. Without them, the workplace was an empty chamber with idle tools. With them, it became an engine of continuity, transforming speech into law, memory into record, intention into obligation. The scribe, though humble, stood at the center of this process. His hand gave form to voices, his tools gave shape to needs, and his labor ensured that Rome's vast machinery of society continued to move. The heart of the scribe's day was not in the noise of clients arriving or in the architecture of the workplace, but in the quiet persistence of his hand moving across surfaces. Writing was both a physical and mental act, demanding discipline from the body and concentration from the mind. To the outsider, it appeared simple, the bending of a figure over a desk, the scratching of stylus, or the flow of ink. But to the scribe, it was a complex performance, one repeated countless times yet never without variation. The posture was deliberate. He sat upon a low stool, the desk angled slightly before him. His feet rested flat upon the ground, his back leaning forward, his shoulders trained against fatigue. Hours of such posture left their mark. A stiffness in the neck, a tightness in the lower back, a dull ache in the wrist that no stretching could entirely relieve. Yet habit turned discomfort into endurance, and the body, through repetition, grew accustomed to the burden. When working on wax tablets, the stylus demanded a particular rhythm. The pointed end, pressed gently yet firmly, cut into the darkened wax, leaving shallow grooves that caught the light. Too much pressure risked breaking the wax surface. Too little left letters faint and unreadable. The scribe guided the stylus with steady hand, drawing lines, curves, and strokes according to the conventions of Latin script. Between each word, the stylus was lifted, then set down again with deliberate care. The act was almost meditative, the scratch of metal against wax forming a muted cadence that filled the otherwise hushed space. Corrections were simple. With the flat end of the stylus he smoothed the wax, erasing a mistake in seconds, then began again upon the restored surface. Papyrus, however, required another kind of precision. With reed pen cut to a sharp nib, dipped lightly into ink, the scribe traced lines across the fibrous sheet. The texture of papyrus guided the pen, its horizontal fibers allowing smoother strokes, its vertical ones offering slight resistance. Too much ink upon the nib led to blotting, black pools spreading across the surface and rendering letters illegible. Too little ink led to faintness, requiring retracing. Between each word, he paused to dip the pen again, the movement so frequent it became as unconscious as breathing. The faint smell of gum arabic mixed with soot rose each time ink touched the page, joining the scent of oil lamps and old scrolls. The speed of writing depended on the task. For notes on wax tablets, speed was possible, even necessary, as when recording dictation or rapid testimony. The hand moved briskly, letters reduced to their essential forms, abbreviations employed, details condensed. For documents on papyrus, speed was tempered by caution. Contracts, decrees and wills required clarity, each stroke made with full awareness of its permanence. Here the pace slowed, the pen lingered at the beginning of letters, curved with steadiness, completed with firmness. Each line was measured, ensuring spacing remained consistent, margins respected and text legible. Mistakes carried weight. On wax they were fleeting, smoothed away in moments. On papyrus, they lingered, stains upon a costly material. Some could be corrected by scraping lightly with a knife, removing the top fibers of the sheet, though the scar remained visible. Others required rewriting an entire section, wasting valuable time and material. The scribe therefore learned a discipline of caution, his eye reading ahead, his mind rehearsing each phrase before setting pen to surface. Mistakes were not simply accidents of hand, they were failures of concentration, and concentration was the essence of his craft. The rhythm of writing, once established, carried a quiet flow. The stylus clicked softly upon wax, the reed pen whispered across papyrus. The repetition of letters built into words, the repetition of words into lines, the repetition of lines into documents. Time slipped differently here. Outside, the city roared with commerce, processions and noise. Inside, the hours were measured by the filling of pages, the slow unrolling of scrolls, the gradual drying of ink. Writing was labor, but it was also suspension, a way of stepping outside the present moment and entering into the stillness of marks taking form. The hand itself bore the signs of this craft. Ink stained the fingertips, sometimes the nails, sometimes the folds of the palm. Calluses formed, where the reed pen pressed against the skin, hardened patches recording the constancy of the task. The wrist ached, sometimes trembling after hours of motion, yet it persisted, driven by habit and necessity. The eyes strained under dim light, squinting at small characters, the flicker of lamps casting uneven shadows upon the page. Fatigue was inevitable, but pauses were brief. The city demanded record, patrons demanded documents, the empire demanded permanence. To the scribe, the act of writing was not only bodily but mental. He carried in his mind the structure of phrases, the conventions of formulae, the abbreviations of names, the patterns of law. His memory guided his hand as much as his tools did. A contract began in predictable fashion, a petition followed set order, a decree required precise phrases. To deviate from these forms risked confusion or rejection. Thus, the act of writing was never improvisation, it was adherence to tradition, the reproduction of forms that gave the Roman world its legal and social coherence. And yet within this discipline, there was subtle individuality. Each hand had its character. Some scribes wrote with broader strokes, some with finer. Some favored a more upright script, others a more cursive flow. The documents of Rome bore these variations, subtle fingerprints of their makers, though rarely noticed by those who read them. The scribe himself was aware, though perhaps unconsciously, of his hand's character, its peculiar rhythm and style. In this way, the act of writing carried traces of individuality, even within the anonymity of duty. Hours passed in this manner, the hand moving, the mind focused, the body enduring. The scribe paused only to stretch fingers, to sharpen the reed pen with a knife, to refill the ink pot, or to smooth the wax once more. These small interludes broke the monotony, but did not disrupt the rhythm. Each return to the page re-established the flow, the silent dialogue between tool, surface and hand. By midday, the desk bore the signs of labor, wax tablets filled with lines, some already smoothed for reuse. Papyrus sheets spread to dry, weighted at the corners to prevent curling, pens resting beside small pools of dried ink, the faint residue of shavings from recut reeds. The act of writing left no spectacle, no noise to rival the streets outside, yet it built something more enduring. Through this quiet, repetitive labor, Rome's laws, contracts and memories were preserved. Thus, The act of writing defined not only the scribe's work but his identity.
It was the posture he assumed daily,
The rhythm that shaped his hours, the discipline that guided his mind. It was an act at once humble and monumental, humble in its obscurity, monumental in its consequence. For each mark he made carried forward into lives, into courts, into archives, into the very continuity of the empire. The Roman scribe lived in a city where words written down carried a power almost greater than words spoken. Rome itself was built upon law, and law required permanence. The permanence was achieved not through memory, for memory faded, nor through speech, for speech dissolved in the air, but through the quiet endurance of documents. A document was the anchor of obligation, the evidence of truth, the memory of the state, and the guarantee of continuity. The scribe was its silent custodian. The documents that passed across his desk varied in form and significance. Some were small, others sprawling. Some were private, others official. Some were ephemeral, others intended for preservation in the state archives. Yet all were shaped by the same tools and hands, emerging from the same rhythm of ink and stylus. Contracts were among the most frequent. In a society where trade was constant, contracts served as the written bones of transactions. A contract might record the sale of land, the hiring of labor, the lease of a property, or the purchase of slaves. The scribe wrote these with careful adherence to formula. Parties were named in full, their status made clear, their obligations spelled out with precision. Dates and witnesses were recorded, clauses ensured enforcement, penalties specified in the event of breach. Each stroke of the pen bound individuals together in agreements that the courts of Rome would later uphold. What seemed to the scribe a repetition of phrases was, to the parties involved, the difference between trust and uncertainty, between wealth and loss. Wills carried even greater weight, for they determined the distribution of property after death. The Roman family was the foundation of society, and inheritance was the thread that linked generations. Wills required the most solemn formulas. They began with invocations, often naming the gods, then proceeded to declare the testator's wishes. Heirs were named, legacies detailed, provisions made for freedmen or slaves. The scribe wrote these words knowing that, long after the testator's death, others would gather around the scroll to interpret his work. A misplaced name, a miswritten clause could change the destiny of entire households. For this reason, wills were sometimes dictated with great formality, the scribe writing in the presence of multiple witnesses who later sealed the document with wax or lead. The moment was heavy with meaning, though for the scribe it was another day's labor. Court proceedings brought yet another form of document. The law courts of Rome produced a ceaseless stream of words, petitions, complaints, verdicts, records of testimony. Some scribes were attached to magistrates or courts, tasked with recording what was said during trials. These records, though imperfect, created a written memory of disputes, judgments, and penalties. The scribe wrote quickly, abbreviating, condensing, sometimes omitting details, for speed was essential. Later, he might be required to prepare a fair copy, smoothing the rough edges into a document fit for storage. These proceedings reflected the living energy of Roman law, yet they also revealed its dependence on writing. Or without scribes, the spoken exchanges of the courtroom would vanish as soon as they were uttered. Letters were of a different kind. Though often personal, they too passed through the hands of scribes. Some were dictated by magistrates, officials, or patrons too busy to write themselves. Others were composed by those without the skill of writing. A letter might carry affection, command, business instructions, or simple news. The scribe, though excluded from the emotions behind the words, gave them form. His hand carried them onto papyrus, rolled them into scrolls, or folded and sealed them for delivery. Letters tied the city to its provinces, families to their absent members, soldiers to their commanders. They were fragile in material, yet immense in consequence. Even the most ordinary tasks required documents. Receipts recorded payments made, goods delivered, or taxes collected. These were brief, sometimes no more than a few lines, yet their importance was practical and immediate. A merchant leaving the marketplace, a farmer paying tribute, or a soldier receiving his stipend, relied upon a small piece of writing as proof of what had transpired. The scribe who produced these brief texts may not have considered their broader value, but without them, disputes multiplied, and trust faltered. Each type of document carried its own format, its own rhythm of words, its own tone. The scribe did not invent these forms. He reproduced them, guided by tradition and necessity. Contracts opened with names, wills with invocations, court records with charges, letters with salutations. To deviate was to invite confusion. Thus, the scribe's role was both creative and constrained, creative in shaping ink into letters, constrained by the formulas that defined meaning. The significance of these documents lay not only in their immediate function, but in their permanence. Once written, they became artifacts of authority. They could be presented in court, preserved in archives, stored in family chests, or carried across provinces. They outlasted memory and circumstance. They gave Rome continuity, linking past action with present enforcement. They were the invisible skeleton of an empire that otherwise seemed to thrive on stone, bronze, and spectacle. The scribe, bending over his desk, was rarely conscious of such grandeur. To him, each document was part of the day's flow, one among many, a task to complete before another began. Yet his labor was not trivial. Each contract shaped livelihoods, each will determined inheritances, each record preserved disputes, each letter conveyed presence across distance. The empire's stability rested in these quiet sheets, and the empire's reach extended through them. The world of documents was thus vast, encompassing the lives of individuals and the demands of the state. It was a world invisible to those who saw only Rome's temples, forums, and triumphs. Yet it was the world that ensured those temples were maintained, those forums governed, and those triumphs remembered. The scribe lived at its center, though he remained unseen, his name unrecorded, his face forgotten, while his documents endured. By the end of the day, the scribe's desk might be covered with such products: contracts awaiting signatures, wills sealed with wax, receipts ready for delivery, letters folded and tied with string. Each carried its own weight, its own expectation of permanence. The scribe gathered them, sorted them, handed them to clients, or passed them to assistants for storage. His hands, tired and ink-stained, had built not monuments of marble, but monuments of text, monuments no less essential to the survival of Rome. As the Roman sun rose higher, the rhythm of the city shifted. The hours before noon carried the greatest flurry of activity, the markets bustling, the law courts filled, the scribes' desks heavy with fresh petitions and contracts. But by midday, when the sun hung almost directly overhead, Rome itself seemed to exhale, and the day softened into a pause. The scribe, like countless others, adjusted to this rhythm, setting down his tools for a brief interlude before work resumed. The heat of the city was not subtle. Rome, built of stone, brick, and packed earth, absorbed the sun and radiated it back into the narrow streets. Dust rose where feet had trodden since dawn, hanging in the air, and mixing with the smell of baked bread, olives, sweat, and smoke. Even the most energetic vendors lowered their voices, their cries subdued by the weight of the heat. Carts slowed, donkeys drooped their heads, and dogs stretched themselves lazily in whatever shade the porticos offered. For the scribe, leaving the tabularium or the small shop where he worked, the brightness of the forum blinded him for a moment. White marble reflected the sun almost fiercely, its brilliance softened only by the shadow of tall columns. He walked carefully, pressing against the shaded edges of porticos and colonnades, where the heat felt less oppressive. His simple tunic clung faintly to his back with perspiration, and the air, heavy with dust, made each breath slower, thicker. The entire city seemed to sink into this atmosphere, as though the heat itself commanded silence. Midday was the time for food, though Romans rarely indulged in extravagance outside of banquets. The prandium, the light meal of the day, served to sustain rather than delight. For the scribe, whose modest means shaped his choices, this meal was simple and direct: a small loaf of bread, often coarse and dense, accompanied by olives whose brine carried the faint taste of the sea. Sometimes a bit of cheese, aged and firm, its flavor sharp upon the tongue, occasionally fruit. figs or grapes when in season, their sweetness offering a contrast to the dryness of bread. If fortune allowed, perhaps a few slices of salted fish, carried inland from the Mediterranean. He ate not at a grand table, but seated upon a stool, perhaps within the corner of the shop, or in the narrow courtyard of the insula, where the faint trickle of water from a fountain softened the air. The meal was accompanied by a cup of diluted wine, for water in the city was not always trusted, and wine, lightened with water, offered both refreshment and safety. The cup was earthenware, plain and unadorned, yet sufficient. He drank slowly, not to savor, but to stretch the brief interlude. Around him, the city shared the pause. The forum's noise receded into a gentler murmur. Magistrates dismissed proceedings until the heat declined, their clerks dispersing for food. Shopkeepers closed shutters halfway, creating dim interiors where shadows pooled. The loudest sounds came from cicadas, their monotonous song rising in the heat, a reminder of nature's persistence even in Rome's heart. From shaded porticos, smoke from small braziers curled into the air, where street cooks prepared simple offerings for those without time or space to eat at home. The smell of lentil stew and grilled vegetables drifted faintly through the streets, mingling with the dryness of dust and stone. For the scribe, this interlude was not only physical, but mental. The hours of writing left his hands stiff, his shoulders heavy, his eyes strained. Rest did not fully restore them, yet the pause offered relief. He flexed his fingers slowly, rotating the wrist, easing the ache left by the stylus and reed. He rubbed his eyes, adjusting to the softer shadows of shade after staring so long at pale wax or papyrus. For a moment he allowed himself to observe without purpose, the flight of pigeons across a rooftop, the ripple of cloth in a shop stall stirred by faint breezes, the slow passage of clouds against the blazing sky. These were not duties, not tasks, but fragments of stillness. Household gods were not absent from such pauses. In many shops and workplaces, a small shrine stood tucked into a corner. The Lars, guardians of household and hearth, honored even in the most modest dwellings. Before resuming his work, the scribe might sprinkle a few drops of wine upon the small altar, or place a piece of bread as offering. The act was not dramatic, but habitual, woven into the fabric of daily routine. It bound him quietly to the continuity of his household, his community, and the unseen forces thought to shape fortune. The city itself seemed to consent to this stillness. Even the great temples stood more silent, their priests withdrawn from ceremony until the sun's decline. The baths too waited for later hours, when citizens would flock to wash, exercise and converse. Midday was neither for the full work of morning, nor the pleasures of evening. It was a threshold, a time suspended, where heat and hunger required the city to fold briefly into itself. In this pause, time elongated. The scribe felt it not as minutes, but as a gradual loosening, an unfolding of hours that gave no urgency. The bread chewed slowly, the cup emptied without haste, the weight of the sun pressing gently upon the body until movement itself seemed unnecessary. If sleep came, it was brief and shallow, seated upright or resting lightly against a wall. The pause did not invite deep dreams but offered a thinning of awareness, a moment of drifting that refreshed by stillness rather than depth. Yet, even as the pause lingered, the city prepared to stir again. Shadows lengthened faintly as the sun began its slow decline. Vendors returned to their cries, carts resumed their creak, voices rose once more across the streets. The air, still hot, grew subtly less oppressive. Life, suspended for a time, resumed its forward rhythm. The scribe gathered his tools once more, stretching his back, adjusting his tunic, brushing the crumbs of bread from his lap. The pause had ended. Ahead lay the continuation of work, more contracts, more wills, more letters to record, more ink to dry upon papyrus. The respite had been brief, yet it allowed the day to be divided, shaped into morning and afternoon, each with its own rhythm. Without such pauses, labor would blur into endless repetition. With them, the day gained structure, even softness. Thus, the midday pause was not a luxury, but a necessity. It was the hinge upon which the day turned, the silence that gave shape to sound, the rest that gave strength to labor. For the scribe, it was as ordinary as the bread he ate, and as essential as the ink he used. Though unrecorded in the annals of Rome, it was part of the daily rhythm that allowed both individual and empire to endure. The scribe's work, though often appearing to serve individual clients or small groups, did not exist in isolation. Each document, each tablet, each roll of papyrus was part of a much larger fabric, the bureaucracy of the Roman Empire. Rome, for all its armies and monuments, for all its spectacles and temples, relied upon an invisible skeleton of records, tallies, decrees and accounts. Without such paperwork, soldiers could not be paid, taxes could not be collected, cities could not be governed, and the empire could not hold together across the vast distances it commanded. At the heart of this bureaucracy lay the scribes. They were neither senators nor generals, neither philosophers nor orators, yet their quiet work sustained the weight of empire. They wrote what others declared, they recorded what others decided, they kept track of what others owned, owed, or paid. In their hands, numbers became fixed, names preserved, obligations remembered. Among the most important of these tasks were the tax records. Rome's survival depended on tribute from its provinces and levies from its citizens. Every field harvested, every flock counted, every workshop producing goods contributed to the stream of wealth that flowed toward the city and its armies. Scribes recorded these contributions in careful lists, ensuring that grain shipments from Sicily or Egypt were accounted for, that taxes from Gaul or Hispania were noted, that landowners within Italy fulfilled their obligations. The documents themselves might never be read beyond the local office, yet together they created the framework by which Rome's treasury was maintained. To miscalculate was to risk imbalance, to forget was to risk loss. Closely tied to taxation were the census rolls. Conducted at intervals, the census was more than a count of people. It was a declaration of identity, status, and property. Citizens appeared before officials, declaring the size of their households, the extent of their lands, the number of their slaves. Scribes stood ready to record these details, writing names, occupations, holdings, and obligations. The census determined not only taxation, but also military service, political representation, and social rank. It was the bureaucracy's mirror, reflecting the structure of Roman society back upon itself. For the scribe, the task meant long hours of steady recording, line after line of names, numbers, and possessions. Though repetitive, these roles shaped the empire's understanding of itself. The military, too, relied on the bureaucracy. Soldiers stationed across distant frontiers required pay, provisions, and equipment. These demands could not be met without records. Scribes wrote muster rolls, listing the names of men in each unit, noting absences, deaths, and new recruits. They recorded the distribution of rations, grain, wine, oil, and salt, ensuring that each legionary received his due. They noted the allocation of equipment, the replacement of weapons, the repair of armor. Behind the clash of battle and the march of armies lay this constant stream of written orders and receipts. A sword might win a skirmish, but a record kept the legion alive. Even the grandeur of Rome's construction projects flowed through scribal hands. Temples, aqueducts, theaters, and roads required immense resources. Stone had to be quarried, wood harvested, metal smelted, and laborers hired. Scribes prepared contracts for supply, recorded wages, and tracked expenses. They listed the names of those employed, the quantities of materials delivered, the stages of work completed. Without these written records, the coordination of such projects would collapse into confusion. The monuments of Rome, admired for their permanence, were built upon documents that rarely survived, yet were essential to their creation. The bureaucracy extended also into the courts and administration. Governors in the provinces relied on scribes to record decrees, correspond with the Senate, and maintain order through documentation. Local disputes, judgments, and appeals all passed into written form. The scribe, though distant from decision-making, was the custodian of its memory. In the provinces especially, where oral traditions often dominated, the introduction of Roman bureaucracy reshaped society. Villages that once relied on spoken agreements now found themselves recorded in ink, bound to obligations visible on papyrus. What made this bureaucracy remarkable was its scale. The Roman Empire stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Germania. Distance alone threatened its unity. But through scribes, words and numbers traveled where armies could not. A decree issued in Rome could be copied, carried, and enforced thousands of miles away. A shipment of grain leaving Alexandria could be tracked to the granaries of Ostia. A soldier's service in Judea could be preserved in records filed within the capital. This vast machine was never perfectly smooth, yet it functioned through the persistent labor of countless scribes, each adding their small part to the whole. For the scribe seated in his modest office, this connection to empire was often invisible. His eyes focused on the narrow column of text before him, his hand busy with formula and repetition. Yet, unseen, the ripple of his work extended outward. The contract he recorded contributed to taxation. The receipt he issued adjusted accounts. The roll he copied became part of a governor's report. His words were absorbed into the bureaucracy, disappearing into a system larger than himself, yet essential to its continuation. The bureaucracy also imposed order upon the scribe himself. His work was guided by strict forms, his time governed by demands, his responsibilities defined by hierarchy. He could not choose his style freely, nor alter phrases at will. Tradition and necessity constrained him. In this way, the bureaucracy shaped not only the empire, but also the lives of those who served it. The scribe, though obscure, was bound as much to its rhythms as the provinces were to its decrees. The documents he produced rarely survived the centuries. Papyrus decayed, wax tablets were reused, wooden tablets discarded. Yet in their time, they carried immense authority. A mark of ink could compel payment. A clause in a will could transfer land. A tally could summon soldiers. A decree could alter laws. The bureaucracy was fragile in material, but firm in consequence. Its strength lay not in permanence of objects, but in the persistence of practice. As long as scribes continued their work, the empire's machinery turned. Thus, the midday pause gave way to afternoon labor, and the scribe once more bent over his tools, feeding the endless appetite of the bureaucracy. Line by line, list by list, contract by contract, the empire was written into being, and in this way, the scribe, though faceless, held a part in the endurance of Rome itself. The Roman world was built not only upon laws and armies, but upon networks of patronage. Every stratum of society was tied together through bonds of obligation and loyalty, where the wealthy and powerful extended protection, and the less fortunate offered service in return. The scribe, though modest in station, was firmly embedded within this structure. His skills made him valuable, his position made him necessary, and his relationship to elite patrons defined much of his workday. The patron's presence was never far from the scribe's consciousness. Even when he sat in the quiet dimness of the workplace, surrounded by the scent of ink and wax, he knew that much of his labor served not abstract institutions but individuals, whose status elevated them above the crowd. These patrons might be senators or magistrates, wealthy landowners, or rising equestrians, men who moved in the circles of Rome's power. Their dependence on scribes revealed a paradox of the ancient world. Those who commanded armies and governed provinces often lacked the patience, the skill, or the inclination to write for themselves. A patron might arrive at the office, accompanied by attendants, his toga carefully draped, his expression one of measured authority. The scribe would rise, not out of reverence for the man's personality, but out of recognition of the system that bound them. The patron's request was both command and necessity. He might require a petition to be drafted, a letter to be sent across the sea, or a decree to be recorded in proper form. The words themselves came from the patron's mouth or mind, but their permanence depended on the scribe's hand. Letters were among the most common tasks. A senator dictating correspondence to a provincial governor relied upon the scribe to transform his spoken phrases into elegant script upon papyrus. The letter would travel by courier, unrolling in a distant city, to carry with it not only information but authority. Without the scribe, the senator's voice would vanish with the air. With the scribe, it could cross mountains, seas and years. The scribe was therefore the silent extension of his patron's presence, the invisible medium through which power moved. Wills and contracts, too, often bore the influence of patrons. Wealthy men entrusted scribes with the careful phrasing of inheritances, the detailing of property, the securing of obligations. The scribe recorded these with precision, conscious that errors might affect not only the patron but entire families, estates and dependents. A misplaced name could disinherit a son. An omitted clause could alter the destiny of lands and wealth. Thus, the scribe's skill underpinned the very structure of elite society. Patrons depended upon him to preserve their intentions beyond their lifetimes. The dependence was mutual though unequal. The scribe gained protection, steady work and a degree of security from his patron. In a society where poverty was widespread and livelihoods precarious, such connections offered stability. A patron might recommend a trusted scribe to colleagues, ensuring more commissions. He might intervene if disputes arose, lending his authority to protect one whose loyalty had proven useful. The scribe in turn demonstrated diligence, discretion, and obedience. He was not free to choose clients at whim. He was drawn into a web of obligations that tied him firmly to the hierarchy of Rome. The relationship was visible each morning during the salutatio, the ritual where clients gathered at a patron's house to pay respect. Though scribes were not always part of this ritual in person, they were often represented by their work. Documents prepared the previous day might be presented during these gatherings, letters sealed and ready for dispatch, contracts to be signed. The patron's household relied on such preparations to project efficiency and order. The scribe's labor, though performed in quieter spaces, echoed in these public moments of display. Social hierarchy shaped every aspect of this dependence. The patron's voice was authoritative. The scribe's was silent. The patron's name stood at the head of documents. The scribe's name was absent. The patron received recognition. The scribe provided function. Yet beneath this imbalance a subtle truth persisted. Without the scribe, the patron's power could not be fully realized. Authority required inscription, and inscription required skill. The scribe, though invisible, was indispensable. In this dynamic lay a reflection of Rome's broader society. The elite depended on the labor of those beneath them, while those beneath relied on the protection of the elite. Farmers tilled the fields that fed the wealthy. Soldiers fought the battles that secured their estates. Scribes wrote the documents that preserved their legacies. Each role was distinct, each necessary, each bound by hierarchy. The scribe seated with ink and papyrus was as essential to the empire's endurance as the general leading legions. Yet history, drawn towards spectacle, rarely named him. The patron's presence could also be felt indirectly, through the demands placed upon the scribe's time. A sudden request for a decree, a hurried need for a contract, a dictated letter to be copied before sunset. These interruptions reminded the scribe that his labor was not his own. His hours bent around the needs of those above him. Fatigue could not excuse delay. Hunger could not excuse mistakes. The patron's authority pressed invisibly upon the desk, shaping the flow of the scribe's day. Even in the material tools, the hierarchy revealed itself. A wealthy patron might provide high-quality papyrus, fine ink and carefully cut reed pens for his documents, while the scribe himself in his own modest affairs made do with reused tablets or cheaper supplies. The contrast was not lost upon him. He handled fine materials daily, yet owned little himself. His hand gave form to the words of the powerful, while his own words rarely left more than temporary impressions on wax. In the evening, when the patron's needs were fulfilled and the documents dispatched, the scribe might reflect upon the nature of this dependence. Not in bitterness, for the system was too deeply woven into life to resist, but in quiet recognition of his place within it. He was both servant and craftsman, both invisible and essential. His patron's presence defined his role, yet his skill defined the patron's reach. It was a relationship of inequality but also of mutual necessity. The presence of patrons shaped not only the scribe's labor, but also the continuity of Roman society. The great names of history, preserved in stone inscriptions, marble busts and senatorial decrees, depended upon countless nameless scribes to carry their voices into permanence. The scribe's obscurity was the price of their fame. Yet without him, the empire's hierarchy would have dissolved into silence. The scribe's work was performed in silence, yet silence was never the true condition of Rome. Around him, and often pressing faintly into the edges of his concentration, lay the hum of a city alive with endless motion. Rome, the largest urban center of the ancient world, was never still, never hushed, and never without its layered symphony of sound. To sit at a desk in the tabularium, or within a modest scribal shop, was to exist inside a pocket of calm, always bordered by the noise of the capital. The city's voice began with the streets. Stone pavements carried the ceaseless grind of iron-rimmed wheels as carts moved goods from the river to the markets. Horses snorted, mules brayed, and drivers shouted encouragement or curses in equal measure. The sound of traffic was not the steady hum of modern engines, but a staccato rhythm of hoofbeats and wheels clattering against stone, echoing unevenly off walls that narrowed streets into canyons. Each turn, each courtyard, each archway multiplied the noise, so that one cart might sound like many, and many together formed a steady rumble beneath the day. Vendors added their voices to this undercurrent. Their cries announced bread fresh from the ovens, olives in jars, figs from the countryside, and fish hauled from the Tiber before dawn. Some called rhythmically, their tones practiced to cut through the clamor, while others barked abruptly, competing for attention. The result was a chorus of offers, each distinct yet blending into a continuous rise and fall, like waves against a shore. For the scribe, seated with stylus or reed pen, these cries became part of the background, their meaning blurred but their cadence unavoidable. Temples contributed a different sound, the ring of bronze bells, the low murmur of prayers, and the occasional music of a procession. Priests chanting litanies, the bleating of sacrificial animals led through streets, the striking of cymbals or pipes, all could drift unexpectedly into the scribe's hearing. Religion was not a private practice in Rome, but a public rhythm woven into the city's daily life. The gods were present not only in marble sanctuaries, but in the soundscape that accompanied work and rest alike. Children added lighter tones. In courtyards and side streets, they played with hoops, knucklebones, and balls stuffed with rags, their laughter piercing through heavier noises. Their games spilled into alleys, and their shrill calls marked the passage of hours more distinctly than sundials. To a scribe bent over contracts or petitions, such sounds could be both distraction and comfort, reminders of life's continuity beyond the written word, voices of a world that existed without ink or wax. Public entertainments carried their own distant echoes. On days of games, the roar of the amphitheater could reach across neighborhoods. A sudden swell of voices, unified in approval or outrage, might momentarily shake the atmosphere, as if the city itself exhaled. Even when faint, such collective noise reminded every inhabitant of Rome's scale, its capacity to gather tens of thousands in one space, their passions rising together. The scribe, though far from the spectacle, could feel its vibrations pass through the city like a pulse. The hum of Rome was not only human. Animals filled its spaces, dogs barking in courtyards, chickens scratching in alleys, donkeys braying as they bore loads of water or stone. Birds nested in the roofs of insulae and temple eaves, their calls weaving lightly through heavier noises. The Tiber itself, though often muffled by walls and buildings, contributed its own sound, the slap of water against stone embankments, the creak of moored boats shifting with the current. Together these elements created a living background, unceasing, varied and dense. Within the scribe's workplace, this hum reached him as a softened tapestry. The thick walls of public offices, or the narrow stalls of shops, did not block sound but filtered it. What entered was less distinct than the source outside, a low blend of rumble, murmur and cry. Over time it became familiar, no longer demanding attention but shaping the texture of concentration itself. Silence in Rome was rare. The scribe did not seek it. Instead he learned to write within sound, his hand steady while the city moved around him. At times, however, the hum broke into sharpness. A quarrel in the street might pierce the background with angry shouts. A sudden procession of soldiers, their sandals striking stone in unison, could overpower ordinary noises. Festivals filled the air with drums, pipes, and cheers, sweeping away the regular cadence of commerce. On such days the scribe might pause, waiting for the clamor to fade before returning to his work. Yet even then he did not resent the intrusion. The city was not separate from his labor, it was its constant companion. The hum also carried reminders of class and distance. From his modest seat, the scribe could sometimes hear the wheels of carriages that only the wealthy were permitted to use, their presence marked not just by sound but by the awareness of privilege. From higher windows came strains of music or poetry recitations, signaling leisure unknown to most. From below, the calls of porters and slaves revealed the burdened labor of the majority. The city's hum was not equal, it was stratified, layered with the echoes of rank and wealth. As evening approached, the hum shifted, but did not vanish. Vendors grew louder as they sold the last of their goods. Carts hurried to complete deliveries before the curfew restricted movement. Lamps were lit, and their soft crackle added a faint note to the soundscape. The city's rhythm slowed, but it did not fall silent. Even at night, voices carried, footsteps echoed, and occasional disturbances broke the dark. For the scribe, whose work often stretched past dusk, the hum remained steady, a reminder that Rome, unlike the countryside, never truly slept. This soundscape was not mere background, it shaped identity. To live in Rome was to live within constant noise, to accept it as the natural condition of existence. Silence belonged to rural villas, to mountain groves, to the distant edges of empire. The scribe, however, belonged to the city, and the city spoke around him always. His quiet work was framed not by absence of sound, but by its steady enveloping presence. The hum of Rome, layered and endless, was the unseen parchment upon which his life unfolded. The scribe's life was measured not in bold actions or dramatic gestures, but in lines of text carefully drawn across papyrus or wax. If the hum of the city was the constant backdrop, accuracy was the constant demand. Every letter mattered, every mark carried meaning, and every small slip of the hand risked more than embarrassment. In a world without duplicating machines, without the safety of multiple copies, each document was singular, fragile, and decisive. The scribe bore upon his shoulders not only the burden of words, but the burden of permanence. Accuracy began with the tools. A reed pen cut too bluntly produced strokes that blurred. One cut too sharply tore the fibers of the papyrus. Ink mixed carelessly, too thin or too thick, would either fade prematurely or blot disastrously. The wax tablet, though forgiving of erasure, demanded careful pressure, too light a touch, and the letters vanished too deep, and the stylus cut grooves that resisted correction. Before words even began, the scribe had to ensure his instruments were exact. A careless reed or an unsteady surface could lead to errors for which he alone would bear responsibility. Once writing commenced, the weight of precision only deepened. A name spelled incorrectly could alter the validity of a contract. A numeral misplaced in a tax record might distort obligations, leading to disputes or penalties. A phrase mistranscribed in a legal proceeding could shift meaning, opening the door to contestation. Words in Rome were not abstractions, they carried the force of law, of property, of inheritance. The scribe's hand therefore acted as a kind of silent arbiter, deciding, through accuracy, whether intentions and realities aligned. The consequences of mistakes were not mild. In some cases, errors demanded complete rewriting, consuming time and resources. Papyrus was costly, ink, though less expensive, required preparation. For a scribe working under patronage, waste reflected poorly, hinting at negligence. In legal contexts, mistakes could bring accusations of incompetence or dishonesty. Scribes were expected to guard not only the clarity of their writing, but also their reputation for trustworthiness. A single error, repeated often enough in whispers, might erode the fragile stability of a career built on patronage and reputation. This weight produced its own mental strain. Concentration became a discipline, one cultivated through repetition, but always threatened by fatigue, distraction, or the simple frailty of human attention. Hours bent over a desk, eyes straining to trace the thin strokes of ink, hands stiffening from the posture of writing. These conditions tested endurance. To maintain accuracy across such stretches demanded more than skill. It required patience and self-restraint. The scribe knew that even as the world outside surged with sound and movement, he must remain fixed, steady, and exact. Accuracy also involved memory and knowledge. Many scribes relied on formulaic phrases, standard openings for letters, standard clauses for contracts, standard structures for wills. These patterns acted as safeguards, anchoring documents in familiar and legally recognized language, yet memory was not infallible. Forgetting a customary phrase or altering its sequence could cast doubt upon the validity of a document. The scribe's mind carried a library of formulas, each of which had to be summoned precisely. Writing was therefore not only a manual act, but an intellectual balancing of recall and application. The mental strain was compounded by dictation. When patrons or magistrates dictated, the scribe had to capture speech faithfully, neither omitting nor embellishing. Human voices, however, were not mechanical. They shifted pace, paused irregularly, or repeated themselves. The scribe's hand needed to match this rhythm without stumbling. A single word misheard could alter meaning. A pause misunderstood could disrupt structure. Unlike casual note-taking, transcription in Rome left little room for ambiguity. Accuracy required listening with full attention, writing with full steadiness, and maintaining composure even when the speaker hurried. The strain of accuracy revealed itself most keenly in the copying of long texts. Whether statutes, speeches, or letters of considerable length, each demanded relentless focus. Errors in such copies were insidious. A skipped line, a repeated phrase, or a miscopied passage might escape immediate notice, only to surface later when the document had already been sealed or delivered. The fear of unnoticed mistakes haunted scribes, pressing them to reread, to check, to compare. Yet time often pressed as urgently as precision, leaving them caught between speed and accuracy, each necessary, each conflicting. Even when successful, the pressure left traces upon the body. Eyes ached from squinting at fine strokes in uneven light. Shoulders stiffened from hunching over the desk. Hands cramped from the grip of pen or stylus, the muscles tightening until letters grew shaky. These physical strains, though rarely remarked upon in surviving sources, were inseparable from the scribe's craft. The pursuit of accuracy was not purely mental, it was bodily, written into joints and tendons as much as into papyrus. The weight of accuracy carried symbolic meaning as well. In Rome, where power was expressed in monuments and decrees, written words embodied permanence. Stone could crumble, speech could fade, but a written document, properly preserved, could bind generations. To inscribe words was to fix them beyond the moment, to tether the authority of the living to the judgment of posterity. The scribe, in ensuring accuracy, ensured that Rome's memory itself remained unbroken. An error was therefore not just a practical flaw, but a fracture in continuity, a weakness in the record that time might exploit. Yet for all its weight, accuracy offered a kind of satisfaction. To complete a document without correction, to see lines evenly spaced and letters precisely formed, gave the scribe a quiet sense of achievement. His name might not appear on the page, but his discipline was inscribed invisibly in the clarity of the text. Accuracy, though burdensome, was also the measure of his skill, the standard by which he could take pride in work unseen and uncelebrated. And so the scribe wrote, day after day, under the constant weight of accuracy. Each word balanced intention and execution. Each line held both promise and risk. He was not free to err, yet he was not free of the human tendency toward error. His craft existed within this tension, measured by the steadiness of his hand and the sharpness of his attention. Accuracy was his burden, his labor, and his legacy, the invisible weight pressing always upon the quiet act of writing. The afternoon in Rome did not rush. After the midday pause, when heat pressed heavily against stone walls and shadows shrank in the brightness of the sun, the city resumed its work with a slower rhythm. The scribe, returning to his desk, found the air thick and still, broken only by the faint stir of a breeze through narrow windows. or the flutter of fabric as clerks and assistants fanned themselves against the lingering warmth. If the morning hours carried the sense of beginnings, with fresh wax and crisp papyrus, the afternoon carried the sense of continuation, of work sustained rather than work initiated. Tasks at this time were rarely novel. Instead, the scribe turned to matters that demanded endurance, copying long records, reviewing earlier drafts, organizing documents for storage or delivery. Piles of tablets or scrolls, accumulated across the morning, awaited ordering. Some required transcription from wax to papyrus, the temporary notes made permanent for preservation. Others required duplication, one copy for the patron, another for the archives, a third perhaps for those directly involved. Accuracy, already a heavy weight, grew heavier in these tasks of repetition. A moment's inattention could transform a faithful copy into a flawed record, and the monotony of copying was itself a danger to concentration. The act of sealing documents often dominated the afternoon. Once a contract, decree, or letter had been inscribed, it required proper closure. Wax, melted carefully, was dripped upon the edges of a folded papyrus, or the cord binding a tablet. Into the warm surface a seal was pressed, the emblem of a patron, magistrate, or official authority. The scribe, though not the owner of such seals, handled them with care, ensuring impressions were clear and complete. The seal was more than ornament. It carried the authority of law, transforming ink into command. A blurred or broken seal could invite suspicion, so the scribe performed this step with the same deliberate patience as writing. Organization was no less important. The empire's administration depended on the orderly keeping of documents. Petitions filed without sequence, contracts misplaced, or records stored carelessly could unravel the trust of patrons and officials. The scribe therefore spent long stretches arranging tablets by date, labeling rolls of papyrus, tying bundles with cord. Archives were not silent vaults of memory, but living spaces of constant movement. Each day added new material, and without diligence, the past would quickly dissolve into disorder. Afternoons also brought more contact with colleagues. Scribes did not always labor alone, in offices of magistrates or public archives. They worked in the company of others. Tables arranged in rows or clusters created small communities of labor. Conversation was muted, for the work demanded concentration, but murmurs passed between desks, requests for a pot of ink, a reed cut more sharply, or clarification of a dictated phrase. These exchanges carried little drama, but revealed the quiet dependence of scribes upon one another. No man could master every detail alone. Collaboration, however, understated, sustained the rhythm of the office. At times camaraderie softened the monotony. A fellow scribe might share a fragment of news heard from the street, a rumor of political developments, or a simple observation about the weather. Another might quietly compare handwriting styles, noting the elegance or steadiness of a colleague's script. These interactions, though restrained, formed bonds within the silence of work. The afternoon's long hours, broken only by scratching pens and the occasional sigh, encouraged such small human connections. They were not friendships in the modern sense, but quiet recognitions of shared labor, of men bound by the same ink-stained discipline. Yet competition also lingered. Accuracy and speed were both valued, and scribes measured themselves against one another in the quality of their script or the number of documents completed. Mistakes could draw criticism not only from patrons but from peers, whose reputations might be linked through shared tasks. In such an environment, the afternoon could become a subtle contest, with each scribe striving for excellence while maintaining the outward appearance of calm. The scratch of reed pens, though uniform in sound, carried beneath it the tension of comparison. The work was not without physical challenges. Afternoon light, falling obliquely through windows or filtered by oil lamps when shadows lengthened, strained the eyes. Dust, stirred by the constant unrolling and re-rolling of papyrus, settled on surfaces, clung to fingers, and sometimes caught in the ink itself. Hands grew tired from repetition, fingers stiffening with the grip of stylus or pen. Some scribes flexed their hands in small circles, shaking stiffness from their wrists before resuming. Others rubbed eyes red from focus, blinking against the blur of fine script. These motions became part of the rhythm. as necessary as the writing itself. Occasionally, visitors disturbed the quiet. A messenger might arrive, demanding a copy be prepared for immediate dispatch. A petitioner might seek clarification of a contract. An attendant of a magistrate could step into the room, his sandals slapping stone to check upon progress. Each interruption reminded the scribes that their labor was not isolated, that the city's vast machine pressed upon them through constant requests. Yet once the interruption passed, silence returned, and pens resumed their steady course across parchment and wax. Toward the later hours of afternoon, a certain weariness set in. The tasks did not diminish, but the body reminded the scribe of its limits. Shoulders ached from the posture of writing, eyes dulled, and thoughts wandered. Still the work demanded completion. Documents left unfinished could not always wait until morning. The flow of administration, trade, and law depended upon punctuality. Thus, even in fatigue, the scribe pressed forward, his pen slower but his determination steady. Each word added weight to the day, each finished document a step closer to release. The afternoon, then, was not defined by drama, but by persistence. It was the span of the day when labor deepened, when repetition tested endurance, when colleagues provided subtle relief, and when the quiet authority of writing revealed its power through countless small acts. The city outside hummed with its own rhythms, but within the walls of the office, the scribe's afternoon was measured in copies made, seals pressed, bundles tied. It was a time not of beginnings or endings, but of continuance, the long middle where the empire's words were inscribed and secured. By the time shadows grew longer, and lamps were lit, the scribe could look upon the neatly stacked scrolls, the sealed tablets, and the orderly bundles with a quiet satisfaction. The afternoon had passed in labor, but the labor had not been in vain. Rome's administration had advanced another step, preserved another record, secured another agreement, and though his name was not on these documents, his hand had shaped them, as surely as a mason shaped stone. The Roman afternoon, once bright and relentless, softened as the sun dipped toward the western hills. Light no longer poured into the city with punishing force, but slanted at an angle, turning stone into amber and rooftops into silhouettes against the reddening sky. In the scribe's workplace, shadows lengthened across desks, creeping between the bundles of papyrus and across the neat stacks of tablets. Oil lamps, set into iron stands or simple terracotta bowls, were readied but not yet lit. For a time the room held both worlds, the fading glow of the sun and the promise of firelight to come. Work slowed. The scratch of reeds against papyrus, constant through the earlier hours, now broke at intervals. Pens were cleaned and laid aside, styluses pressed into their cases, seals tucked into drawers. Some scribes still pressed on, determined to finish the day's final copy, but the urgency had diminished. What was incomplete could often wait until morning. The rhythm of the office shifted from labor to conclusion, from creation to careful tidying. The scribe, stretching stiffened fingers, rolled and tied the last of his scrolls, his movements less hurried than in the heat of the day. The atmosphere reflected this easing. Colleagues, who had exchanged only brief murmurs during hours of work, now allowed themselves a few words more freely. Quiet remarks about supper, about the weather, or about family waiting at home drifted between desks. The solemn intensity of the day yielded to something gentler, as though the diminishing light loosened the discipline that held each man in silence. There was relief in this transition, not celebration, but a small release of tension, like the exhale after a long-held breath. When at last the time came to depart, the scribe gathered his few belongings. A tablet of wax, perhaps for private notes, a small satchel for coins or bread, a cloak if the evening carried a chill. The tools of writing, carefully tended, remained in their place, waiting for the next day. He stepped from the dimness of the office into the city streets, where the air itself seemed changed. The heavy stillness of midday had lifted, replaced by movement and sound. Evening in Rome was a spectacle of transition. Vendors called out their final bargains, eager to sell perishable goods before nightfall. Bakers carried out fresh loaves, their aroma mingling with the smoke of hearths being lit for supper. Children darted through the alleys, freed from errands, while older citizens strolled more leisurely, enjoying the cool air. Temples stood in the golden light, their columns glowing softly, while priests prepared lamps to burn within their precincts. Musicians appeared at corners or taverns, their notes carrying above the hum of the crowd. For the scribe, walking home was as much a part of the day as the writing itself. The streets revealed the layers of society once more, senators passing in litters borne by slaves, merchants closing their shops, laborers dusted with the grit of their trades returning with weary steps. The city was never equal, but in the narrowing streets at dusk, all classes brushed past one another. The scribe, modestly dressed, moved quietly within this flow, neither commanding notice nor entirely invisible. The senses were filled anew, the sharp scent of fish salted for sale, the sweetness of figs, the acrid smoke of torches being lit. The warmth of stone walls, still holding the day's heat, contrasted with the first hints of cooling air as shadows deepened. Voices overlapped, bargaining, laughter, arguments, greetings. Wheels of carts creaked over uneven stones. Dogs barked at the stir of movement. This was the hum of Rome, not diminished by evening, but transformed, slower yet somehow richer. As he walked, the scribe passed familiar landmarks, a shrine at a crossroads, where citizens paused to leave offerings, a fountain where water flowed endlessly into a stone basin, the looming outlines of temples and forums now touched with dusk. He moved steadily, his body tired, but his mind settling. The weight of ink and accuracy lifted with each step, replaced by the simple prospect of rest. Evening was not an escape, but a restoration, a necessary balance to the demands of the day. Arriving at his insula, the modest apartment building he called home, the scribe climbed narrow stairways worn by countless feet. The building carried its own sounds, the shuffle of neighbors preparing meals, the chatter of children, the distant strains of a lyre from another room. Within his own chamber, small and spare, he found stillness. The single window admitted the last traces of light, now faint and fading. A lamp was lit, casting its glow upon simple furnishings, a bed of straw and cloth, a stool, a shelf with a few belongings. Here the day's labors finally loosened their hold. The scribe might take bread, cheese, or olives for his supper, eating with the quiet focus of one who has worked long and asks little of the evening. A cup of watered wine offered comfort, easing the strain in his body. Before rest, he might pause at a small household shrine, murmuring thanks to the Lares, the guardian spirits, for the safe passage of another day. The rituals were simple, but they grounded him in continuity, tying personal routine to the greater order of city and cosmos. Outside, Rome continued to breathe. Torches and lamps cast shifting circles of light upon the streets, while voices carried later into the night. Taverns filled, songs rose, arguments flared, lovers met. Yet within his chamber, the scribe settled into calm. The transition to evening was complete, from labor to rest, from public duty to private stillness. Tomorrow would demand the same rhythm, but for now the city could carry on without his hand. The day closed not with grandeur, but with quiet endurance, as the scribe lay upon his modest bed, listening to the hum of Rome fading into night. The tools of writing slept in their places, the words of empire paused until dawn, and the scribe himself drifted into rest, ready to rise again to the same unending cycle. The Roman evening descended gradually, neither abrupt nor silent. The scribe, having returned to his dwelling, now prepared for the moment of rest that most clearly divided the labors of day from the slumber of night, the cena, the evening meal. Unlike the banquets of senators, or the indulgent feasts immortalized in poetry, his supper was modest, simple, and in keeping with the rhythms of the working classes of Rome. In the small room of his insula, lit only by a clay lamp whose flickering flame drew faint shadows along the plaster walls, the meal began not with ceremony, but with routine. Bread, coarse and dense, formed the foundation. It was bread baked in communal ovens earlier that day, purchased still warm or stored carefully to last. Its crust was firm, and the crumb carried the faint tang of sour fermentation, a flavor familiar and reliable. To this he added olives, dark and glistening with oil, their brine sharp upon the tongue. Cheese, perhaps a soft sheep's milk variety, offered a richer counterpoint, cut in rough portions and eaten slowly. For drink there was wine, though not as the wealthy consumed it. His was thin and heavily watered, more sustenance than indulgence, a mild comfort that eased the dryness of bread and the salt of olives. Wine, even diluted, carried a sense of civilization, a reminder that this was Rome, where water alone was rarely trusted, and where the vine had long been a companion to daily life. The amphora from which it had been drawn stood in a corner, sealed with pitch, its contents diminishing little by little with each evening. Sometimes, when fortune allowed, the scribe might add lentils or beans, boiled in a small pot, seasoned with herbs, dill, coriander, or fennel, if such could be spared. These legumes, humble yet nourishing, thickened the meal into something more sustaining. A drizzle of olive oil lent smoothness, while bread served to scoop and soak the softened grains. On rarer occasions, perhaps after being paid for a particularly large task, he could afford fish, salted and preserved, purchased from a vendor near the Tiber. Meat was rare, far beyond the regular diet of a man of his standing, though a scrap of pork fat or sausage might occasionally find its way onto his plate as a luxury. The act of eating was quiet. Neighbors in other rooms of the insula could be heard, their own meals producing faint clatters, murmured words, or children's laughter, but within his own chamber the scribe dined alone. The space was small, and meals were taken seated on a stool or cross-legged on the floor, food laid upon a simple wooden board. There were no couches draped in cloths, no reclining as poets described of wealthier homes. For the working poor, the cena was not a performance but an interval of necessity, taken with as little ceremony as the writing of a receipt. And yet, within its modest scope, there was a rhythm, a form of restoration. The steady breaking of bread, the deliberate chewing, the measured sips of watered wine. These slowed the body and signaled to it that the labors of the day were over. Even in such simplicity, the meal carried meaning. To eat after work was to affirm survival, to acknowledge that another day had been endured and concluded. The food was not luxurious, but it was sufficient, and sufficiency itself was a kind of quiet wealth. Custom lingered in the small gestures. Before and after the meal, hands were rinsed in a bowl of water, for cleanliness was necessary even in narrow rooms. A few crumbs or drops of wine might be set aside in honor of the household gods, placed at the base of the small shrine that watched silently from a niche. In this way, eating was never entirely separate from religion, for the divine was seen in all continuities, in bread rising, in vines fruiting, in oil pressed from olives. The stillness of the cena allowed the mind to drift. Thoughts of the day's work returned, the documents copied, the petitions drafted, the signatures recorded, but with distance now, as though they belonged to another life. The hands that held bread were the same hands that held stylus and reed, yet the tasks were different, the evening freeing him from the weight of accuracy and the sharp discipline of ink. Here there were no errors to fear, no words to misplace, only food to be consumed, wine to be sipped, and the quietness of one's own company. Outside, Rome carried its own rhythm of supper. In the grand domus of the wealthy, cena stretched into hours, with multiple courses, musicians, and reclining guests. Dishes of dolmas, oysters, roasted meats, and spiced sauces appeared in abundance, accompanied by fine Falernian wine. But the scribe, walking home earlier, had passed no invitation to such excess. His place was here, in his narrow room, in the shared silence of countless others, who ate the same bread, drank the same watered wine, and ended their days without spectacle. This contrast did not embitter him. It was the nature of Rome, the order of its classes, the structure upon which the city stood. His task was not to overturn it, but to exist within it, to perform his role in the machinery of record and law, and then to rest in modesty. As bread was finished, and the last olives eaten, he felt not envy but weariness, softened by the small satisfaction of sustenance. When the meal ended, the remains were tidied, crumbs brushed aside, bowls rinsed with a little water, lamp trimmed to burn longer. The room, still modest, now carried the faint scents of oil and bread, the air warmer from the lamp's flame. His body eased with the fullness of food, his thoughts slowed by wine's quiet influence. Outside, voices still carried, children calling, merchants bargaining the last of their goods, taverns filling with drinkers, but inside stillness reigned. The evening meal was not a feast, nor was it intended to be. It was the threshold between labor and rest, a pause that acknowledged the day's end and prepared the body for night. In this pause, the scribe found what he needed: calm, quiet, and the enduring rhythm of Rome's ordinary life. When the bread had been eaten, the last of the watered wine consumed, and the lamp flame adjusted, so that it cast a steady glow against the pale plaster, the scribe's attention shifted from the table to the small, ever-present figures that watched from their niche. These were the household gods, the Lares and the Penates, guardians not of the empire's grandeur, but of its countless individual homes. Their presence was modest, represented by tiny statuettes of clay or bronze, perhaps weathered by years of touch and smoke, yet they bore significance as steady as stone temples and public altars. The scribe approached the shrine as he did each evening, not with ceremony fit for a pontifex or priest, but with the steady gestures of habit. A few crumbs of bread, saved from his meal, were set carefully before the figurines. A drop of wine, poured into a shallow dish, carried the fragrance of the grape toward the unseen spirits. The offerings were small, almost invisible in scale compared to the sacrifices made in temples or at civic festivals, but they were sufficient for this purpose: to acknowledge the gods, to maintain the bond of reciprocity, and to remind the mortal household that it existed under divine gaze. The Lares, protectors of place and family, symbolized continuity. For the scribe, who dwelled in an insula with shifting neighbors and the noise of many lives pressing in around him, their presence offered a sense of permanence. Though tenants came and went, and though the city itself seemed in constant motion, these figures remained. They did not require grandeur, only acknowledgement. In them lay the reassurance that one's daily survival mattered, not only to one's own effort, but to the wider order of the cosmos. The Penates, tied to provisions and the storage of food, were equally important. Each meal depended upon their favor, each loaf of bread and amphora of wine connected to their silent guardianship. To leave them without offering was unthinkable, for sustenance itself was precarious in a city so vast. Grain ships might be delayed, prices might rise, harvests might fail, yet the Penates gave a sense that the household was never entirely at the mercy of chance. Tradition taught that their presence steadied fortune, that they stood between hunger and security. The scribe did not kneel for long, nor did he speak at length. His prayer was likely silent, or spoken in simple words, no elaborate verse but straightforward gratitude for survival through the day, and a request for protection through the night. These murmurs were for his ears and the gods alone, never written down, never recorded in the kinds of documents he spent his daylight hours producing. They were part of the invisible realm of personal piety that underpinned the very visible machinery of Rome's religious life. As he rose and returned to his stool, the faint smoke from the lamp curled around the shrine. Its light caught the tiny features of the figurines, casting their expressions into shadow. For a moment, the scribe observed the play of flame against clay, the way fire seemed to give the gods breath. It was an image repeated across countless Roman homes, a silent continuity of faith that spanned all classes, in a senator's domus or a soldier's tent, in a shopkeeper's backroom or a farmer's hut. The Lares were fed, the Penates honored, the gods remembered in the privacy of the hearth. Such rituals required little expense, which was part of their endurance. Even the poorest citizen, provided with bread and wine, could afford to set aside a fragment. This universality bound Rome together in ways that laws or armies could not. Each evening, in thousands of homes, small offerings renewed invisible threads that wove the city into a shared order of divine oversight. To neglect the gods was to risk imbalance, not only for oneself, but for the household, and by extension the community. The scribe knew this. Though he lived without luxury, though his name might never be preserved in records beyond his own hand, these gestures tied him to something larger. They gave rhythm to life, as essential as eating or working, to rise without prayer, to eat without offering, to sleep without recognition of divine guardianship. Such omissions would have left the day incomplete. The empire was vast, but its cohesion rested not only on emperors and legions, but on countless acts like this, carried out in private, steady as the turning of the sun. With the offerings complete, the scribe allowed the calm of ritual to settle upon him. His chamber was small, but it held a shrine. His food was plain, but it was blessed. His life was modest, but it was part of Rome's greater whole. In this he found not triumph, but steadiness, and steadiness was enough. The lamp flame wavered once, then steadied again, its glow touching the clay figures as though acknowledging the bond renewed. Outside, the city murmured with voices and footsteps, with the sounds of taverns and the clatter of carts, but here, in this quiet corner, tradition endured, unbroken. The scribe leaned back, the weight of the day slipping further from his shoulders, his breath slowing as the night deepened. When the last crumbs had been set aside for the household gods, and the lamp flame steadied against the deepening dark, the city beyond the scribe's walls continued its restless life. Rome, unlike the countryside, did not sleep entirely. Night merely transformed it, softening some parts while sharpening others, drawing forth sounds, shadows and movements that daylight kept at bay. From his small window, the scribe could see little but the narrow slice of street below, and yet that fragment revealed much of the city's nocturnal rhythm. Lamps had been lit along major streets, placed at intervals by slaves or watchmen, their light faint but persistent, casting circles that left long stretches in shadow. Torches flared outside taverns, smoke curling into the air, while the glow from workshops or bakeries revealed trades that continued into the late hours. Rome did not rely on the sun alone. The labor of its people ensured activity even under the stars. The sounds of the night were distinct from those of the day. The clatter of carts lessened, for wheeled traffic was restricted within the city after sundown, but the wooden wheels of a few exceptions could still be heard, echoing against stone. Instead of vendors calling their wares, the hum came from taverns, where laughter, song, or arguments spilled into the streets. Dogs barked at shadows, sometimes in sudden packs, their voices rising and fading as quickly as they began. From temples came the faint murmur of evening rituals, the chant of priests attending to gods who, unlike mortals, did not require sleep. Yet, night was not without its dangers. Rome was vast, crowded, and filled with those who lived on its margins. Thieves and cut-purses roamed, seeking opportunity in darkened alleys where lamps did not reach. Brawls broke out near taverns, sometimes loud, sometimes quick and silent. For this reason, the city relied upon the vigils, the watchmen who patrolled after dusk. Armed with staves and carrying lanterns, they moved in groups. Their presence meant both to deter crime and to respond to fires, for fire was the greatest terror of the Roman night. In an insula of wood and plaster, a single overturned lamp or neglected torch could send flames racing upward, devouring homes in minutes. The watchman's footsteps, steady and deliberate, were both reassuring and a reminder of this ever-present threat. The scribe, within his chamber, listened as the city's nocturnal voice rose and fell. Sometimes a loud cry would pierce the stillness, followed by silence as quickly as it came. Sometimes the rhythmic steps of patrols passed below, their lanterns briefly illuminating the street before fading away. To constant murmur of distant voices wove a backdrop that never entirely ceased. Sleep in Rome was taken against this fabric of sound, a reminder that the city, unlike smaller towns, never fully rested. From rooftops and upper stories, the night sky could be glimpsed. In places where lamps and torches did not obscure the heavens, stars stretched across the darkness, their constellations the same that guided sailors on distant seas. The moon, when visible, bathed streets in pale light, softening the harshness of stone into something almost gentle. To the scribe, lying on his modest bed, the presence of these celestial bodies was distant but steady, a cosmic order above the restless noise of Rome. Within the insula, the life of neighbors carried on. Couples whispered, children fussed, the scrape of a stool or the thud of a closed door echoed faintly through thin walls. Privacy in such buildings was limited, One lived not alone but among others, their lives pressing in even at night. Yet these sounds, familiar and ordinary, formed part of the comfort. They reminded the scribe that he was not isolated, that others too carried out their rituals of supper, prayer, and rest, each contained in their own narrow space. The dangers of night remained, but they were largely at a distance. To leave home after dark was a risk, especially for one without attendance or protection. The scribe had no reason to do so. His work was bound to daylight, his role complete once he had left the tabularium or the office. Night was for eating, for honoring the gods, and for rest. The streets might belong to thieves, drunkards, watchmen, and the restless poor, but his place was here, within walls, with the lamp burning low, and the gods watching silently from their niche. The flickering flame of the lamp became its own companion. It cast shadows that moved gently along the walls, transforming the modest room into a shifting landscape of light and dark. Each movement of flame suggested motion, yet no sound followed. In such play, the scribe found both calm and unease, calm in the continuity of firelight, unease in the reminder of its danger. Lamps were life-giving but precarious, for in their flames lay the possibility of destruction. This duality, familiar to every Roman, was accepted as part of existence, neither wholly trusted nor wholly feared. As the hours deepened, the city did not grow silent, but it thinned. Taverns emptied gradually, their voices fading. Dogs quieted. Even the watchman's steps became less frequent. Rome, enormous and restless, at last yielded to a slower rhythm, though never fully still. The scribe, eyes heavy, lay back upon his bed, the thin blanket drawn across him, listening as the night's hum became softer. Outside, lamps guttered out one by one, leaving darkness broken only by the moon and the last steady flames of those who, like him, had not yet surrendered to sleep. Thus the Roman night passed, not silent, not safe, not entirely restful, but enduring, as constant as the cycle of day and dusk. Within it, the scribe drifted towards sleep, carried by the sounds of a city that never wholly closed its eyes. The city, still murmuring in its nocturnal rhythm, had not yet fully surrendered to rest. Yet within the scribe's chamber stillness prevailed. The lamp flame burned low, its oil diminishing, casting faint circles of light that did not fully banish the shadows. Reclining on his narrow bed, his body heavy with the weight of the day's labors, the scribe found his thoughts drifting, not toward dreams, but toward the quiet meditations that sometimes came at the close of evening, when nothing further remained to be done. In the silence, he considered his own work. By day, his hand had been busy, line upon line inscribed, contracts copied, receipts tallied, and wills preserved. The movements had been precise, deliberate, repeated countless times. Yet what endured of them? A slip of papyrus tied with string, a wax tablet bearing notations that might be erased and rewritten, a seal pressed into clay that might one day crumble. His hours of labor produced objects fragile in their nature, dependent upon storage, preservation, and the interest of those who commissioned them. A misplaced fire, a careless hand, or the indifference of time could reduce them to dust, leaving no trace of his effort. It struck him, not for the first time, that his own role was invisible within the empire he served. His writing enabled the transactions of merchants, the petitions of citizens, the authority of magistrates, yet his name rarely appeared within the texts themselves. He was the conduit, not the subject. Others' voices filled the documents, while his contribution dissolved into the neatness of script, meant to be legible but anonymous. If the empire were to be described in marble inscriptions, laws carved for posterity, generals honored in triumphal arches, it would not be his hand acknowledged, though his hand had recorded countless details that sustained the same order. This invisibility was not unique to him, it was the condition of many. The city thrived because of those who labored without recognition, bakers, builders, porters, washerwomen, all of whom supported Rome's life, while leaving little trace in its monuments. To think on this was not bitterness but observation, a detached recognition of the structure in which he lived. Rome's greatness was built not only on emperors and legions, but on thousands of hands like his, hands whose work vanished as soon as it was complete, replaced by new tasks, new demands, new documents. Yet there was also a certain stability in this impermanence. The fragility of papyrus, or wax, mirrored the fragility of life itself. Neither words nor men endured forever, but both belonged to the machinery of the present, to the daily cycle that kept order against chaos. His role was not to be remembered, but to maintain continuity, to hold the fabric of administration together, one document at a time. If history forgot his name, it mattered little, for his contribution was measured not in remembrance, but in the steady functioning of the city. Still, the thought lingered, what became of all the words he wrote? Contracts fulfilled, receipts discarded, wills executed, petitions answered or ignored. Each piece of writing served a purpose, then ceased to matter. The act of writing was labor, but its result was temporary. Perhaps this was the nature of words, to exist for a time, to guide an action, to preserve a moment, and then to pass away, no different than breath. Marble and bronze carried names into centuries, but papyrus, ink, and wax lived briefly, fragile as the hands that inscribed them. The scribe did not dwell on this with sorrow, rather it was a calm acknowledgement of transience. He was part of a cycle larger than himself, one that required precision without demanding immortality. His words would vanish, but the practice of writing would continue, carried on by others, day after day, as Rome endured. What mattered was not the endurance of the individual, but the persistence of the function, the continual recording, the endless repetition, the machine never ceasing. In this realization, there was a kind of peace. To exist as a cog within the machinery of empire was to be freed from the burden of glory. His work was necessary, though not celebrated, essential though not immortal. He was neither exalted nor despised, but part of the vast middle, the unrecorded multitude whose quiet labors sustained the visible achievements of Rome. The flicker of the lamp caught his eye again, its light wavering as the oil burned low. How similar it seemed to the words he wrote. A brief illumination, useful while it lasted, then fading into darkness once its purpose was spent. Yet, even as one lamp guttered out, another could be lit. Even as one document perished, another would be written. Continuity, not permanence, was the true substance of Rome. As his eyes grew heavier, the scribe's thoughts drifted towards sleep. The day had begun in dawn's bustle, moved through hours of labor, and ended in quiet reflection. Tomorrow would repeat the same pattern, as would the day after, a cycle as unending as the turning of the heavens above the city. He was one among thousands, his role small but steady, his life modest but woven into the fabric of Rome. To recognize this was neither despair nor pride, but acceptance. In this acceptance he surrendered to rest, the lamp flame dwindling as night deepened. Outside, Rome continued its restless murmurs, but within the chamber, stillness prevailed. The scribe's reflections dissolved into sleep, as transient as the words he had inscribed, carried away by the passage of time. The darkness stretched across the city, like a vast unbroken cloth, began at last to thin. Somewhere beyond the hills, the faintest pallor touched the horizon, neither gold nor red, but a colorless suggestion of light. It crept slowly into the alleys, brushing the tiled roofs, softening the sharp edges of shadow. Within the insular walls, the air remained cool, heavy with the smell of last night's extinguished lamps, bread crusts, and lingering smoke from nearby hearths. For the scribe who stirred at the shifting of dawn, there was nothing remarkable in the new day's arrival. It was not an event but a resumption, an imperceptible return to what had been before. The previous night's reflections, those fleeting meditations that flickered like the flame of his lamp, had dissolved into sleep. What remained was habit. Rising, he reached for the same garments folded at his bedside, the same belt, the same sandals, worn but serviceable. The basin of water received his touch, his face cooled by the ritual of cleansing. At the household shrine, he offered a brief gesture, words muttered with the same cadence as the day before, neither fervent nor absent-minded, but practiced, as though tradition itself spoke through him. The city, outside his door, was awakening in familiar rhythm. Carts groaned along the stones, wheels jarring against ruts cut by countless journeys. Vendors prepared their stalls with little variation from yesterday's cries. Temples opened their doors, their priests adjusting garments that had been adjusted countless mornings before. The city's hum gathered once again, not in novelty but in continuity. In the endless press of humanity, the scribe's departure from his insula went unnoticed. One figure among thousands, absorbed into the greater flow. The walk through the streets was a repetition of earlier steps. Familiar doorways appeared in sequence, each as constant as the colonnades of temples, or the watchful eyes of statues. Those he passed, traders, servants, craftsmen, were not strangers, though they bore no names in his memory. They belonged to the recurring backdrop of the city, as much a part of it as paving stones or fountains. His path did not demand attention, it demanded movement, and movement alone. Arriving at his place of work, the scribe encountered no ceremony, no fresh beginning. The same benches, the same wax tablets, the same rolls of papyrus lay before him, awaiting inscription. The room smelled faintly of ink, dust, and the lingering wax of seals pressed into soft clay. He sat, adjusted his tools, and began. The lines formed beneath his hand with steady rhythm, measured strokes neither hurried nor sluggish. Mistakes, when they came, were corrected with the same patience as before. Clients arrived, papers were exchanged, transactions recorded, contracts witnessed, wills preserved. Nothing altered, nothing deviated. The day unfolded as a mirror of those that preceded it. The sun climbed, casting the same light upon the same walls, then declined, lengthening shadows in their familiar procession. Midday meals passed without novelty. Afternoon labors resumed. As the city shifted toward evening, the scribe's hand did not falter, nor did it change in character. He was one of many, part of the ongoing machinery, producing documents destined to serve their purpose and vanish, as so many had before. When the work concluded and he returned home, the pattern continued. A meal, modest and unremarkable, a gesture to the household gods, the slow descent into night. Beyond his walls, Rome remained restless, its sounds echoing against stone, its life ceaseless in both grandeur and monotony. Within, the scribe settled into quiet, his body prepared for rest, his mind already yielding to the inevitability of repetition. And so the cycle closed, not with finality, but with continuation. The dawn that had come would come again. The documents that had been written would be replaced by others. The hands that labored would be followed by other hands. Nothing altered in essence, though all things passed in detail. His life was one thread in the woven fabric of Rome, a thread neither bright nor dark, but part of the pattern nonetheless. To live thus was to accept forgetfulness. His name would not survive, nor his words, nor the fragile records he preserved. Yet the cycle would persist beyond him, as it had before him, as it would after him. The empire endured not because of permanence, but because of the endless, unremarkable repetition of lives such as his. And as the lamp flickered once more, and the city beyond his window murmured toward another dawn, the scribe's existence folded seamlessly into the rhythm of Rome, steady, quiet, and soon forgotten.